Yeah, you know who it is. King in yellow, 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 king in yellow. Hello, hello. Bring this back up to me. Hi, I am Grey Waste Tim, and this is the Tales of Hastur Talk of Euron stream. If you are a fan of David Lightbringer, Lucifer means Lightbringer, you might have seen me on his the five forts and beyond stream. During that stream, we were talking King in Yellow, and Dave was kind enough to let me go off on this tangent, this idea I have of Euron Greyjoy possibly being an avatar for Hastur. Hey, Damon. For Hastur, who is one of the elder gods, half-brother of Cthulhu. Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. We're just getting started. So for this stream, we're going to be reading some short stories from the Hastur cycle and talking what inspirations they may have had on George, and definitely talking where Euron Greyjoy fits in on all of this. So when we look at Hastur, he starts off as a deity. He is a god of shepherds in the Ambrose Bierce story, Haïta the Shepherd. And as Hastur is adapted by other authors, it takes a whole different turn. He goes from being a deity in Haïta the Shepherd to a place in Robert W. Chambers stories in The King in Yellow. Hastur is a city, the birthplace of Casilda, who is one of the main characters in the King in Yellow play. It's ambiguous what exactly, if Hastur is the city that she is a queen over, or if she is merely a claimant to the throne of another city, Yatil. Hastur also appears as a supernatural character in another chamber story, the Demoiselle Dace. And Hastur is then taken up by other authors. August Derleth incorporates him as a deity, and which is where we get the Hastur cycle. Hastur is also the name of the ruling family in Marion Zimmer Bradley's Darkover series. That was supposed to take place on an alternate Earth, but when Marion Zimmer Bradley became aware of the Cthulhu Mythos that was beginning to develop, she kind of pivoted away from that and put Darkover on an alternate star, a red star that isn't exactly Aldebaran, where Hastur resides, but basically just trying to incorporate it into the Cthulhu Mythos that had been coming about. Just making sure, because everyone can hear me, right? Do we have any audio issues? Just checking in the chat. Any lag? Anything like that? Okay, so we're just going to move forward then with our first story. Well, first we're going to read... Sounds good. Thanks. Thank you, Michael James. Okay, so first we're going to start off with the poem Carcosa. This is by Richard L. Tierney, and this is just to give us an intro to Hastur and a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about. I sense on crystal winter evenings, when constellations gleam through black branch trees, a night dark star no earthly gazer sees, to which some dread malevolently clings. No star chart shows, no, yet slumber brings its vision from the clustered Hades. Black waters over which a leaden breeze wafts the sad song that dead Casilda sings. No darker vision greets the sleeper than that lake from which the coiling cloud waves pour to break along the long basaltic shore. Beneath the rays of red Aldebaran, the lake whence dreamers flee in nameless dread as Hastur rises from his slimy bed. So, Hastur is known by many. He is Hastur the Unspeakable. He is the King in Yellow. He is he who is not to be named, the feaster from afar, the dweller in the depths, the great prince of the old ones, the high priest of the star spawn. He is a god of decadence, disorder, and nihilism. And yes, I do. He is a god of the rejection of all religious and moral principles in the belief that life is meaningless. And if that just doesn't sound like Euron Greyjoy, a man who is trying to become a god while waging a war against the perceived gods of the Song of Ice and Fire universe. And this is where we're going to go in on these stories. So if at the beginning I had said, so Hastur in the earliest incarnation is a god of shepherds who appears in Haïta the Shepherd by Ambrose Bierce, and then is later adapted into a city, a person, a place, a thing. But we're going to be focusing more on Hastur as an entity, focusing on his beginning as a sort of benign, sort of benevolent god in Haïta the Shepherd. But then as he is taken by other authors who contributed to the Cthulhu Mythos, August Derleth takes him and turns him into an elder god. He makes him the half-brother of Cthulhu and the enemy of Cthulhu. And really, and as the story goes on, we'll see other authors dip their toes into these waters. After we do the Return of Hastur, I'm going to read fragments of Tatters of the King by Lynn Carter, who was one of George R.R. Martin's friends in life. Now, Carter and George were friends. Carter was actually one of George. I believe he was one of George's editors. But Lynn Carter passed away in 1988. So when we talk editor, we're talking George's old story. This is before Song of Ice and Fire. He passed before the first book was written. But still, him and George had a friendship. And Lynn Carter heavily contributed to the Cthulhu Mythos and also the Carcosa Mythos, because he, along with author James Blish, they actually tried to take the King in Yellow and sort of write like an actual play for it. Now, can't really do that because the whole idea of the King in Yellow play and the chamber story is that to read the play will cause madness, which is something we can't really incorporate in the real world. So obviously the play goes unfinished, but they did create a first act and a second act that can be read like an actual play script. So, but we're going to be starting with Haïta the Shepherd. So, and this is by Ambrose Bierce, the first appearance of Hastur, where he is a god of shepherds. In the heart of Haïta, the illusions of youth had not been supplanted by those of age and experience. His thoughts were pure and pleasant, for his life was simple and his soul devoid of ambition. He rose with the sun and went forth to pray at the shrine of Hastur, the god of shepherds, who heard and was pleased. After performances of this pious rite, Haïta unbarred the gate of the fold and with a cheerful mind drove his flock afield, eating his morning meal of curds and oatcake as he went, occasionally pausing to add a few berries, cold with dew, or to drink of the waters that came away from the hills, to join the stream in the middle of the valley, and be borne along with it, he knew not whither. During the long summer day, as his sheep cropped the good grass which the gods had made to grow for them, or lay with their forelegs doubled under their breasts and chewed the cud, Haïta, reclining in the shadow of a tree or sitting upon a rock, played so sweet music upon his reed pipe that sometimes from the corner of his eye he got accidental glimpses of the minor Sylvian deities, leaning forward out of the copse to hear, but if he looked at them directly, they vanished. From this, for he must be thinking if he would not turn into one of his own sheep, he drew the solemn inference that happiness may come if not sought, but if looked for will never be seen, for next to the favor of Hastur, who never disclosed himself, Haïta most valued the friendly interest of his neighbors, the shy immortals of the wood and stream. At nightfall, he drove his flock back to the fold, saw that the gate was secure, and retired to his cave for refreshment and for dreams. So already we're seeing a lot of language here that we can see in A Song of Ice and Fire. The immortals of the wood and stream, the dreamers, and the relaxed atmosphere that Haisha's living in. Like it's a lot of children of the forest imagery that we can sort of pick up on here. And Haisha as a shepherd, what's important here in the story, why I felt like I wanted to start with Haisha the shepherd is when we think of the shepherds in A Song of Ice and Fire, along with the Lazarine and their god, the Great Shepherd. And there's also the original Valyrians, who we're told were originally shepherds before coming upon dragons in the 14 Flames. And we'll get more on that as we get deeper into the story. So passed his life, one day like another, save when the storms uttered the wrath of an offended god. Then Haisha cowered in his cave, his face hidden in his hands, and prayed that he alone might be punished for his sins and the world saved from destruction. Sometimes when there was a great rain and the stream came out of its banks, compelling him to urge his terrified flock to the uplands, he interceded for the people in the cities which he had been told lay in the plain beyond the 2 blue hills forming the gateway of his valley. It is kind of thee, O Hastur, so he prayed, to give me mountains so near my dwelling and my fold that I and my sheep can escape the angry torrents. But the rest of the world thou must thyself deliver in some way that I know not of, or I will no longer worship thee. And Hastur, knowing that Haisha was a youth who kept his word, spared the cities and turned the waters into the sea. So he had lived since he could remember. He could not rightly conceive any other mode of existence. The holy hermit who dwelt at the head of the valley, a full hour's journey away from whom he had heard the tale of the great cities where dwelt people, poor souls, who had no sheep, gave him no knowledge of that early time when, so he reasoned, he must have been small and helpless like a lamb. It was through thinking on these mysteries and marvels, and on that horrible change to silence and decay, which he felt sure must sometime come to him, as he had seen it come to so many of his flock, as it came to all living things except the birds, that Haisha first became conscious how miserable and hopeless was his lot. It is necessary, he said, that I know whence and how I came, for how one can perform his duties unless able to judge what they are by the way in which he was entrusted with them. And what contentment can I have when I know not how long it is going to last? Perhaps another son I may be changed, and then what will become of the sheep? What indeed will have become of me? Pondering these things, Haisha became melancholy and morose. He no longer spoke cheerfully to his flock, nor ran with alacrity to the shrine of Hastur. In every breeze he heard whispers of malign deities whose existence he now first observed. Every cloud was a portent signifying disaster, and the darkness was full of terrors. The night is long and full of terrors. His reed pipe, when applied to his lips, gave out no melody, but a dismal wail. The Sylvian and Riparian intelligences no longer thronged the thicket side to listen, but fled from the sound, as he knew by the stirred leaves and bent flowers. He relaxed his vigilance, and many of his sheep strayed away into the hills and were lost. Those that remained became lean and ill for lack of good pasturage, for he would not seek it for them, but conducted them day after day to the same spot through mere abstraction, while puzzling about life and death, of immortality he knew not. One day, while indulging in the gloomiest reflections, he suddenly sprang from the rock upon which he sat, and with a determined gesture of the right hand exclaimed, I will no longer be a suppliant for knowledge which the gods withhold. Let them look to it that they do me no wrong. I will do my duty as best as I can, and if I err, upon their own heads be it. Suddenly, as he spoke, a great brightness fell about him, causing him to look upward, thinking the sun had burst through a rift in the clouds, but there were no clouds. No more than an arm's length away stood a beautiful maiden. So beautiful she was that the flowers about her feet folded their petals in despair and bent their heads in token of submission. So sweet her look that the hummingbirds thronged her eyes, thrusting their thirsty bills almost into them, and the wild bees were about her lips. And such was her brightness that the shadows of all objects lay divergent from her feet, turning as she moved. Haisha was entranced. Rising, he knelt before her in adoration, and he laid her hand upon his head. Come, she said in a voice that had the music of all the bells of his flock. Come, thou art not to worship me who am no goddess, but if thou art truthful and dutiful, I will abide with thee. Haisha seized her hand, and stammering his joy and gratitude arose, and in hand they stood and smiled into each other's eyes. He gazed on her with reverence and rapture. He said, I pray thee, lovely maid, tell me thy name, and whence and why thou comest. At this she lay a warning finger on her lips and began to withdraw. Her beauty underwent a visible alteration that made him shudder. He knew not why, for still she was beautiful. The landscape was darkened by a giant shadow sweeping across the valley with the speed of a vulture. In the obscurity, the maiden's figure grew dim and indistinct, and her voice seemed to come from a distance as she said in a tone of sorrowful reproach, Presumptuous and ungrateful youth, must I then so soon leave thee? Would nothing do, but thou must at once break the eternal compact. Inexpressibly grieved, Haisha fell upon his knees and implored her to remain, rose and sought her in the steepening darkness, ran in circles, calling to her aloud, but all in vain. She was no longer visible, but out of the gloom he heard her voice saying, Nay, thou shalt not have me by seeking. Go to thy duty, faithless shepherd, or we shall never meet again. Night had fallen, the wolves were howling in the hills, and the terrified sheep crowded around Haisha's feet. In the demands of the hour, he forgot his disappointment, drove his sheep to the fold, and repairing to the place of worship, poured out his heart to Hastur for permitting him to save his flock, then retired to his cave and slept. When Haisha awoke, the sun was high and shone in at the cave, illuminating it with a great glory. And there beside him sat the maiden. She smiled upon him with a smile that seemed the visible music of his pipe of reeds. He dared not speak, fearing to offend her as before, for he knew not what he would venture to say. Because, she said, thou didst thy duty by the flock, and didst not forget to thank Hastur for staying the wolves of the night. I am come to thee again. Wilt thou have me for a companion? Who would not have thee forever, replied Haisha. Oh, never again leave me until I change and become silent and motionless. Haisha had no word for death. I wish indeed, he continued, that thou wert of my own sex, that we might wrestle and run races, and so never tire of being together. It does have a lot of maiden made of light. There's definitely also a lot of the way she's beckoning, the way she comes and goes. There's also a lot of Melisandre in this. In a way, this Haisha is sort of, don't want to say simping for her, but he is pining for her in the way that a lot of A Song of Ice and Fire characters pine for these beautiful, otherworldly women. At these words, the maiden arose and passed out of the cave, and Haisha, springing from his couch of fragrant boughs to overtake and detain her, observed to his astonishment that the rain was falling, and the stream in the middle of the valley had come out of its banks. The sheep were bleating in terror, for the rising water had invaded their fold, and there was danger for the unknown cities of the distant plain. It was many days before Haisha saw the maiden again. One day he was returning from the head of the valley, where he had gone with ewe's milk and oat cake and berries for the holy hermit, who was too old and feeble to provide himself with food. Poor old man, he said aloud, as he trudged along homeward. I will return tomorrow and bear him on my back to my own dwelling, where I can care for him. Doubtless it is for this that Hastur has reared me all these many years and gives me health and strength. As he spoke, the maiden clad in glittering garments met him in the path with a smile that took away his breath. I am come again, she said, to dwell with thee if thou wilt now have me, for none else will. Thou mayest have learned wisdom, and art willing to take me as I am, nor care to know. Haisha threw himself at her feet. Beautiful being, he cried, if thou wilt but deign to accept all the devotion of my heart and soul, after Hastur be served, it is thine forever. But alas, thou art capricious and wayward. Before tomorrow's sun I may lose thee again. Promise, I beseech thee, that however in my ignorance I may offend, thou wilt forgive me and remain always with me. And this is the thing that Haisha's not getting, is that I hate using the word, but he really is simping. And that is why she keeps disappearing. Scarcely had he finished speaking when a troop of bears came out of the hills, racing towards him with crimson mouths and fiery eyes. The maiden again vanished, and he turned and fled for his life. She released the bears. Nor did he stop until he was in the cot of the holy hermit, whence he had sat out. Hastily barring the door against the bears, he cast himself upon the ground and wept. My son, said the hermit from his couch of straw, freshly gathered that morning by Haisha's hands, it is not like thee to weep for bears. Tell me what sorrow hath befallen thee, that age may minister to the hurts of youth, which such balms as it hath of its wisdom. Haisha told him how thrice he had met this radiant maid, and thrice she had left him forlorn. He related minutely all that had passed between them, omitting no word of what had been said. When he had ended, the holy hermit was a moment silent, then said, My son, I have attended to thy story, and I know the maiden. I have myself seen her, as have many. Know then that her name, which she would not even permit thee to inquire, is Happiness. Thou say'st the truth to her that she is capricious, for she imposeth conditions that man cannot fulfill, and delinquency is punished by desertion. She cometh only when unsought, and will not be questioned. One manifestation of curiosity, one sign of doubt, one expression of misgiving, and she is away. How long didst thou have her at any time before she fled? Only a single instant, answered Haisha, blushing with shame at the confession. Each time I drove her away in one moment. Unfortunate youth, said the holy hermit, but for thine indiscretion, thou mightst have had her for two. Happiness. Happiness comes for a moment and is gone in an instant, and it only comes when you aren't seeking it. And when you try and chase after it, it flies away. But we can see in this Hastur, the god that he's praying to, is sort of a benign deity. It's sort of like the a lot of the gods in the Song of Ice and Fire, because it's very ambiguous as to whether Hastur is actually answering Haisha's prayers, because occasionally he grants him a boon, and Haisha has his moments of happiness, and he has his flock, and he has his simple life. But then other time, Hastur sends storms, and there's also with the old hermit that death and age are still things here. So it's like with any god or gods, sometimes they're benevolent, sometimes they're capricious, sometimes they're malevolent, or sometimes they're just working with a light touch. Like if anyone's seen Futurama, you see in that episode where Bender's floating out in space and he sort of meets God, and it's the idea of if you're doing it right, it's like you haven't done anything at all. Oh, yeah, 920. Anyone, smoke them if you got them, if you want to praise Garth. But that was Hastur. That's Hastur in his first incarnation as the benign god of shepherds. And as the Cthulhu myth, as he's incorporated the Cthulhu mythos, first by August Derleth and later on by other authors, he's going to shift and change and be twisted and become this malevolent deity, this god of disorder and decadence. Now, Lovecraft, for his part, it only mentions Hastur once in passing, and that's in The Whisperer in the Darkness. The quote, I found myself faced by names and terms that I had heard elsewhere in the most hideous of connections: Yagath, Great Cthulhu, Sithagwa, Yog-Sothoth, Ryla, Nyarlathotep, Azathoth, Hastur, Yan, Leng, the Lake of Holly, Beth Mora, the Yellow Sign, Lemur Cthulhus, Bran, and the Magnum in Nomendium. A lot of God, Lovecraft is really, really hard when you can't pronounce things. and was drawn back through nameless eons and inconceivable dimensions to worlds of elder, outer entity at which the crazed author of the Necronomicon had only guessed in the vaguest way. There is a whole secret cult of evil men. A man of your mystical erudition will understand when I link them with Hastur and the Yellow Sign, devoted to the purpose of tracking them down and injuring them on behalf of the monstrous powers from other dimensions. Now, the thing about when Lovecraft mentions Hastur is he mentions it along with a whole list of people, places, and things. And there's no actual order to what he's doing because he starts with the Goth, which is a place. But then the second thing he mentions is Great Cthulhu, who is a thing or a being, a deity. Saying then Sithagwa, a being, Yog-Sothoth, a being, Ryla, a place, Nyarlathotep, a being, Azathoth, a being, Hastur, we don't know, Yen, a place, Lang, a place, the Lake of Holly, a place. There's no rhyme or reason when Lovecraft says Hastur, if he is meaning to invoke a deity or if he's meaning to invoke a city, a star, a planet. We don't know. And again, this is because Lovecraft was inspired by both Ambrose Bierce and Robert W. Chambers. And like I said near the beginning of the stream, in Bierce's story, Hastur is a deity, a benign deity of God of Shepherds. But in Chambers, the majority of Chambers' story, Hastur is a city. The city of Casilda and Camilla, a city that's mentioned in the Repair of Reputations. But again, in Robert W. Chambers' other story, the Demoiselle Dace, Hastur is he's a character. It's a groundskeeper, sort of supernatural. And so it's hard. So it's really hard to say when Lovecraft mentioned Hastur, what exactly he meant. Now, August Derleth is the one who really wanted to kind of jumble all these things together. And he's the one who really takes Hastur off and makes him, okay, Hastur is a deity and he is part of the mythos and he is related to Cthulhu, but he is an enemy of Cthulhu. And before proposing the actual name, the Cthulhu Mythos, he wanted to call it the Cycle of Hastur. Now, Lovecraft sort of laughed him off, saying, no, like Hastur is not the most important thing. But we don't know if Hastur might have become more important because of Lovecraft's passing. Again, Hastur is only mentioned in that one short story. So when we want to get Hastur as a deity, we're looking more towards the August Derleth and the rest of Lovecraft's contemporaries that came after his passing who contributed to the Cthulhu Mythos. The issue with the Cthulhu Mythos, and I've said this both in our last stream in the Carcosa and Beyond stream and when I was live with David Lightbringer on the 5/4 stream, is there's been so many fingers in this pie. It becomes a convoluted mess. Like same with Hastur, where is he a deity? Is he is it a place? Is it a city? Is it a planet? Is it a star? The same happens with Carcosa. Same happens with the Lake of Holly. Sometimes it's not even a lake, and it's hard to say. Like, is it a city? Is Carcosa a city? Is Holly an actual lake? Does it exist on Earth? Is it another planet? Is it part of the Dreamlands? A lot of this differs depending on the author and the particular short story you're reading. But for this stream, since we're focusing on Hastur as a deity, and since the main focus of this is going to then be focusing on Hastur as a parallel to Euron Greyjoy, we're going to focus on Derleth's main intention, which was to create Hastur as a deity. So the next short story that we're going to read is going to be The Return of Hastur by August Derleth. Now, I have my own criticisms against August Derleth. I appreciate what he did, and they're going to crop up as we read the story. You're going to tell I'm not the biggest fan of Derleth, but what he's putting here is going to be important for our discussion about Euron, because these are where the real Euron parallels are going to go up, and that's when we can really have some fun tackling Euron as a character and his whole parallels and juxtaposition to Hastur. So I just got to find my page number again. I should have bookmarked it. Okay, 248. Oh, and the book that I'm reading from is the Hastur cycle. This is a collection of short stories. There is the Whisper in Darkness by H.P. Lovecraft appears. There's an Inhabitant of Carcosa, which I read in the first stream that I did. The Carcosa and Beyond stream is in this. So are two chamber stories, as well as James Blish's More Light and Lynn Carter's Tatters of the King, which we're going to read some excerpts from, in which they try to adapt The King in Yellow into a sort of proper play with a script that can be read. So we're going to go to The Return of Hastur. Actually, it began a long time ago. How long I have not dared to guess, but so far as concerned my own connection with the case that has ruined my practice and earned me the dubiety of the medical profession in regard to my sanity, it began with Amos Tuttle's death. That was on a night in a late winter, with a south wind blowing on the edge of spring. I had been in ancient legend-haunted Arkham that day. He had learned of my presence there from Dr. Ephraim Sprague, who attended him, and had the doctor call the Lewiston house and bring me to that gloomy estate on the Aylesbury Road near the Innsmouth Turnpike. So, again, since we're talking August Derleth, there's going to be a lot of references to older Lovecraft's work. For those who aren't in the know, August Derleth was a contemporary of Lovecraft, sort of his benefactor. He established Arkham Publishing, and it's through Derleth that a lot of Lovecraft's works were published, because a lot of Lovecraft's short stories were published posthumously after his passing. Now, Derleth himself, I've said before, and I stick to it, I think his mistake was he tried to take the unknowable and put it in a box and make it easy to categorize. And that's going to pop up a lot in the story. Like we're going to get to it. We're going to get to it. But I do appreciate Derleth. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of his writing and his contributions, I do appreciate what he did in getting all of Lovecraft's stories together, getting them published and getting them out there. Because we do, just his shortcomings aside, we owe a lot to any Lovecraft fan owes a lot to August Derleth. Even if they hate him, you can't deny we owe a lot to Derleth in getting us a lot of these stories out here. And he had hardly the strength to motion Sprague from the room and talk to me, though his voice came clearly enough and with little effort. "You know my will," he said. "Stand by it to the letter." That will had been a bone of contention between us because of its provision, that before his heir and sole surviving nephew, Paul Tuttle, could claim his estate, the house would have to be destroyed, not taken down, but destroyed, together with certain books designated by shelf number in his final instructions. His deathbed was no place to debate this wanton destruction anew. I nodded, and he accepted that. Would to heaven I had obeyed without question. "Now then," he went on, "there's a book downstairs you must take back to the library of Miskatonic University." He gave me the title. At that time it meant little to me, but it has since come to mean more than I can say, a symbol of age-old horror, of maddening things beyond the thin veil of prosaic daily life, the Latin translation of the aborted Necronomicon by the mad Arab, Abdul al-Hazrad. I found the book easily enough. For the last 2 decades of his life, Amos Tuttle had lived in increasing seclusion among books collected from all parts of the world. Old worm-eaten texts with titles that might have frightened away a less hardened man. The sinister De Vermis Mysteries of Ludwig Prynne, Comte d'Erlet's terrible Cultus des Ghouls, von Juntz's damnable Una Sprechlichen Karten. I cannot not speak German words angrily. I did not know then how rare these were, nor did I understand the priceless rarity of certain fragmentary pieces, the frightful Book of Iban, the horror-fraught Nicotic manuscripts, and the dread Ryla text. For these I found upon an examination of his accounts after Amos Tuttle's death, he had paid a fabulous sum. But nowhere did I find so high a figure as that he had paid for the Rhyolatex, which had come to him from somewhere in the dark interior of Asia. According to his files, he had paid for it no less than $100,000. And this is in 1930s money. But in addition to this, there was present in his account in regard to this yellowed manuscript a notation which puzzled me at the time, but which I was to have ominous cause to remember, after the sum above mentioned Amos Tuttle had written in his spidery hand, in addition to the promise. Say it again, Carl. Un Sprauklichen Colton, if I'm pronouncing that right. These facts did not come out until Paul Tuttle was in possession, but before that, several strange occurrences took place, things that should have aroused my suspicion in regards to the countryside legends of some powerful supernatural influence clinging to the old house. The first of these was of small consequence in view of the others. It was simply that upon returning the Necronomicon to the library of Miskatonic University at Arkham, I found myself conveyed by a tight-lipped librarian straight away to the office of the director, Dr. Lanfear, who asked me bluntly to account for the books being in my hands. I had no hesitation in doing so, and thereby discovered that the rare volume was never permitted out of the library, that in fact Amos Tuttle had abstracted it on one of his rare visits, having failed in his attempts to persuade Dr. Lanfear to permit his borrowing it. And Amos had been clever enough to prepare in advance a marvelously good imitation of the book, with a binding almost flawless in its resemblance, and the actual reproduction of title and opening pages of the text reproduced from his memory. Upon the occasion of his handling the Mad Arab's book, he had substituted his dummy for the original, and gone off with one of the 2 copies of the shunned work available on the North American continent, one of the 5 copies known to be in existence in the world. So for me, this is like some. I get the idea. If we were looking at this in George's work, this might be something that Jockin's going to have to deal with when he finds the book he's looking for in the Citadel. The idea that he might have to replace it with a dummy copy, or perhaps even memorize it before he can get out. And Amos Tuttle, for his part, we get a lot of who is the Lord of the High Tower? Who is Lord Leighton Hightower, the man atop the tower with his daughter, the Mad Maid, who's been secluded for a decade, just reading these books, these lost texts. You read so forcefully. Will Jockin get to the book before Sam? That's a good question, actually. I'm excited to see where that goes. So we got some Leighton Hightower things. There's also, since we're going to be talking Euron later on, we're also going to be that's going to bring up probably some discussion of Roderick the Reader. And Amos Tuttle, for his part, also seems like a Roderick the Reader type, just a guy who's just like, I just want to be left alone with my books. The second of these things was a little more startling, though it bears the trappings of conventional haunted house stories. Both Paul Tuttle and I heard at odd times in the house at night, while his uncle's corpse lay there particularly, the sound of paddling footsteps. But there was this strangeness about him. They were not like footsteps falling within the house at all, but like the steps of some creature in size, almost beyond the conception of man, walking at a great distance underground, so that the sound actually vibrated into the house from the depths of earth below. And when I have reference to steps, it is only for lack of a better word to describe the sounds, for they were not flat steps at all, but a kind of spongy, jelly-like sloshing sound made with the force of so much weight behind them that the consequent shuddering of earth in that place was communicated to us in the way we had heard it. There was nothing more than this, and presently it was gone, ceasing coincidentally enough in the hours of that dawn when Amos Tuttle's corpse was borne away 48 hours sooner than we had planned. The sounds we dismissed as settlings of the earth along the distant coast, not alone because we did not attach too great an importance to them, but because of the final thing that took place before Paul Tuttle officially took possession of the old house on Aylesbury Road. Yes. Squishers. Them squishers out there. As that most esteemed marine biologist, Dr. Nimble Richard Crabb, would tell us. Shout out to David Lightbringer. There's going to be many shout outs to Dave. Dave's been Dave's been real cool to me. He is like my benefactor, like the big brother that I never knew. It's been really helping me out a lot, and really got to go check out the streams. Go check out Nimble Dick's Squisher Hunt. And later as we get also go check out the green men of Leng. I think that's the video title. Dave, if I'm getting that wrong, just let me know. I have it linked in the video info because I am going to be making reference to that one later when I bring up Leng. This last thing was the most shocking of all, and of the three who knew it, only I now remain alive. Dr. Sprague being dead this day a month, though he took only one look and said, "Bury him at once." Excuse me. So we did, for the change in Amos Tuttle's body was ghastly beyond conception, and especially horrible in its suggestion. And it was so because the body was not falling into any visible decay, but changing subtly in another way, becoming suffused with a weird iridescence, which darkened presently until it was almost ebon, and the appearance on the flesh of his puffy hands and face of minute scale-like growth. There was likewise some change about the shape of his head. It seemed to lengthen, to take on a curious kind of fish-like look, accompanied by a faint exudation of thick fish smell from the coffin. And that these changes were not purely imaginative was shockingly substantiated when the body was subsequently found in the place where its malignant after-dweller had conveyed it. And there, at last, falling into putrefaction though it was, others saw with me the terrible, suggestive changes that had taken place, though they had mercifully no knowledge of what had gone before. But at the time when Amos Tuttle lay in the old house, there was no hint of what was to come. We were quick to close the coffin, and quicker still to take it to the ivy-covered Tuttle Vault in Arkham Cemetery. He's turning into a squisher while he dies. So yeah, we can see right here, Amos Tuttle's body is transforming. It's becoming fish-like. It's giving off a fish odor. Now, he's dead. He's decaying. But the body really should not. But the body should not be changing like this, especially not so soon after death. Paul Tuttle was at that time in his late 40s, but like so many men of his generation, he had the face and figure of a youth in his 20s. Indeed, the only hint of his age lay in the faint traces of gray in the hair of his mustache and temples. He was a tall, dark-haired man, slightly overweight, with frank blue eyes, which years of scholarly research had not reduced to the necessity of glasses. Nor was he ignorant of law, for he quickly made it known that if I, as his uncle's executor, were not disposed to overlook the clause in his will that called for the destruction of the house on the Aylesbury Road, he would contest the will on the justifiable ground of Amos Tuttle's insanity. I pointed out to him that he stood alone against Dr. Sprague and me, but I was at the same time not blind to the fact that the unreasonableness of the request might very well defeat us. Besides, I myself considered the clause in this regard amazingly wanton in the destruction it demanded. It was not prepared to fight a contest because of so minor a matter. Yet could I have foreseen what was to come, could I have dreamed of the horror to follow, I would have carried out Amos Tuttle's last request regardless of any decision of the court. However, such foresight was not mine. We went to see Judge Wilton, Tuttle and I, and put the matter before him. He agreed with us that the destruction of the house seemed needless, and more than once hinted at concurrence with Paul Tuttle's belief in his late uncle's madness. The old man's been touched for as long as I knew him, he said dryly. And as for you, Hayden, can you get up on stand and swear that he was absolutely sane? Remembering with a certain uneasiness the theft of the Necronomicon from Miskatonic University, I had to confess that I could not. So Paul Tuttle took possession of the estate on the Aylesbury Road, and I went back to my legal practice in Boston, not dissatisfied with the way things had gone, and yet not without a lurking uneasiness difficult to define, an insidious feeling of impending tragedy, no little fed by my memory of what we had seen in Amos Tuttle's coffin before we sealed and locked it away in the centuries-old vault in Arkham Cemetery. My God, Derleth, you and the long sentences. One reason that I'm not the greatest fan of Derleth's writing is his prose. So many things of what he says can be said in so many fewer words. I feel like this story could be like 5 pages shorter. It was not for some time that I saw the Grambrel roofs and Georgian balustrades of Witch Curse Arkham again, and then was there on business for a client who wished me to see to it that his property in ancient Innsmouth was protected from the government agents and police who had taken possession of the shunned and haunted town, though it was now some months since the mysterious dynamiting of blocks of the waterfront buildings and part of the terror-hung Devil Reef in the sea beyond. A mystery which has been carefully guarded and hidden since then, though I have learned of a paper purporting to give the true facts of the Innsmouth horror, a privately published manuscript written by a Providence author. People, that was all one sentence. That was all one sentence. It was impossible at that time to proceed to Innsmouth because Secret Service men had closed all roads. However, I made representations to the proper persons and received an assurance that my client's property would be fully protected, since it lay well back from the waterfront. So I proceeded about other small matters in Arkham. It's like a kid trying to meet word count in his essay. I went to luncheon that day in a small restaurant near Miskatonic University, and while there, heard myself accosted in a familiar voice. I looked up and saw Dr. Lanfer, the university library's director. He seemed somewhat upset and betrayed his concern clearly in his features. I invited him to join me, but he declined. He did, however, sit down somewhat on the chair's edge. "Have you been out to see Paul Tuttle?" he asked abruptly. "I thought of going this afternoon," I replied. "Is anything wrong?" He flushed a little guiltily. "That I can't say," he answered precisely. "But there have been some nasty rumors loose in Arkham, and the Necronomicon is gone again." "Good heaven, you're surely not accusing Paul Tuttle of having taken it," I exclaimed, half in surprise, half amused. I could not imagine of what use it might be to him. "Still, he has it," Dr. Lanfer persisted. "But I don't think he stole it, and should not like to be understood as saying so. It is my opinion that one of our clerks gave it to him and is now reluctant to confess the enormity of his error. Be that as it may, the book has not come back, and I fear we shall have to go after it." "I could ask him about it," I said. "If you would, thank you," responded Dr. Lanfer a little eagerly. "I take you've heard nothing of the rumors that are rife here." I shook my head. "Very likely they are only the outgrowth of some imaginative mind," he continued, but the air of him suggested that he was not willing or able to accept so prosaic an explanation. "It appears that passengers along the Aylesbury Road have heard strange sounds late at night, all apparently emanating from the Tuttle house." "What sounds?" I asked, not without immediate apprehension. "Apparently those of footsteps, and yet I understand no one will definitely say so, save for one young man who characterized them as soggy, and said that they sounded as something big were walking in water and mud nearby." The strange sounds Paul Tuttle and I had heard on the night following Amos Tuttle's death had passed from my mind, but at this mention of footsteps by Dr. Lanfer, the memory of what I had heard returned in full. I fear I gave myself slightly away, for Dr. Lanfer observed my sudden interest. Fortunately, he chose to interpret it as evidence that I had indeed heard something of these rumors, my statement to the contrary notwithstanding. Yes, to hide complex ideas behind simple prose, not these run-on sentences, purposely using these $30 words. Shallow and pedantic, yes. I did not choose to correct him in this regard, and at the same time I experienced a sudden desire to hear no more. So I did not press him for further details, and presently he rose to return to his duties, and left me with my promise to ask Paul Tuttle for the missing book still sounding in my ears. His story, however slight it was, nevertheless sounded within me a note of alarm. I could not help recalling the numerous small things that held to memory. The steps we had heard, the odd clause in Amos Tuttle's will, the awful metamorphosis in Amos Tuttle's corpse. There was already then a faint suspicion in my mind that some sinister change of events was becoming manifest here. Hey, buddy. I share this room with Damon, so that's why he's always making his presence known in these streams, aren't you, boy? You live in the den too. Okay. My work in Arkham consumed the afternoon, and it was not until dusk that I found myself standing before the massive oaken door of the old Tuttle house on Aylesbury Road. My rather peremptory knock was answered by Paul himself, who stood, lamp held high in hand, peering out into the growing night. Haddon, he exclaimed, throwing the door wider. Come in. That he was genuinely glad to see me, I could not doubt, for the note of enthusiasm in his voice precluded to any supposition. The heartiness of his welcome also served to confirm me in my intention not to speak of the rumors I had heard, and to proceed about an inquiry after the Necronomicon at my own good time. I remembered that just prior to his uncle's death, Tuttle had been working on a philological treatise related to the growth of the Sac Indian language, and determined to inquire about this paper as if nothing else were of moment. Yeah, just normal things. Normal theses we're working on here. You've had supper, I suppose, said Tuttle, leading me down the hall and into the library. I said that I had eaten in Arkham. These simple complexities. He put the lamp down upon a book-laden table, pushing some papers to one side as he did so. I apologize. Sometimes I do like to keep up with what you guys are saying in the chat. Just, paying attention to the chat and reading directly from the book. But I thank you, though. I thank everybody for showing up for the I'm brain farting on words here. Fuck you, Derleth, and your prose. You got me. You use too many words, and now you take all my words. He put the lamp down upon a book-laden table, pushing some papers to one side as he did so. Inviting me to sit down, he resumed the seat he had evidently left to answer my knock. I saw now that he was somewhat disheveled, and that he had permitted his beard to grow. He had also taken on more weight, doubtless as a consequence of strictly enforced scholarship, with all its attendant confinement to the house and lack of physical exercise. That's me during quarantine, when just 2 weeks of never leaving the house when I had COVID. I'm pretty sure I put on some pounds. I gotta get out walking. We got the dogs. I gotta take them for more walks when the snow melts. How fares the sack treatise? I asked. I've put that aside, he said shortly. I may take it up later. For the present, I've struck something far more important. Just how important, I cannot yet say. I saw now that the books on the tables were not the usual scholarly tomes I had seen on his Ipswich desk, but with some faint apprehension observed that they were the books condemned by the explicit instructions of Tuttle's uncle, as a glance at the vacant spaces on the prescribed shelves clearly corroborated. He's reading the forbidden books. I told you not to read those books. Tuttle turned to me almost eagerly and lowered his voice as if in fear of being overheard. As a matter of fact, Haddon, it's colossal. A gigantic feat of the imagination. Only for this, I'm no longer certain that it is imaginative. Indeed, I'm not. I wondered about that clause in my uncle's will. I couldn't understand why he should want this house destroyed, and rightly surmised that the reason must lie somewhere in the pages of those books, so he carefully condemned. He waved a hand at the incunabula before him. So I examined them, and I can tell you I have discovered things of such incredible strangeness, such bizarre horror, that I hesitate sometimes to dig deeper into the mystery. Frankly, Haddon, it is the most outre matter I have ever come upon, and I must say it involved considerable research, quite apart from these books Uncle Amos collected. Indeed, I said dryly, and I dare say you've had to do considerable traveling. He shook his head. None at all, apart from one trip to Miskatonic University Library. The fact is, I found I could be served just as well by mail. You remember those papers of Uncle's? Well, I discovered among them that Uncle Amos paid $100,000 for a certain bound manuscript, bound in human skin, incidentally, together with a cryptic line, in addition to the promise. I began to ask myself what promise Uncle Amos could have made, and to whom. Whether to the man or woman he had sold this Riley text, or to some other. I proceeded forthwith to search out the name of the man who had sold him the book, and presently found it, with his address, some Chinese priest from Inner Tibet, and wrote to him. His reply reached me a week ago. He bent away and rummaged briefly among the papers on his desk until he found what he sought and handed it to me. I wrote in my uncle's name, not trusting entirely in the transaction, and wrote, moreover, as if I had forgotten or had a hope to avoid the promise, he continued. His reply is fully as cryptic as my uncle's notation. Hey, buddy. Indeed, it was so, for the crumpled paper that was handed to me bore in a strange stilted script but one line, without signature or date, to afford a haven for him who is not to be named. I dare say I looked up at Tuttle with my wonderment clearly mirrored in my eyes, for he smiled before he replied. Means nothing to you, huh? No more did it to me when I first saw it, but not for long. In order to understand what follows, you should know at least a brief outline of the mythology, if indeed it is only a mythology, in which this mystery is rooted. My Uncle Amos apparently knew and believed all about it, for the various notes scattered in the margins of his proscribed books bespeak a knowledge far beyond mine. Apparently, the mythology springs from a common source with our own legendary Genesis, but only by a very thin resemblance. Sometimes I am tempted to say that this mythology is far older than any other. Certainly in its implications it goes far beyond, being cosmic and ageless, for its beings are of two natures and two only, the old or ancient ones, the elder gods of cosmic good, and those of cosmic evil, bearing many names, and themselves of different groups, as if associated with the elements and yet transcending them. And this is where we start to dive into what I say is Derleth's biggest mistake. For there are the water beings hidden in the depths, those of air that are the primal lurkers beyond time, those of earth, horrible animate survivals of distant eons. Incredible time ago, the old ones banished from the cosmic places of all the evil ones, imprisoning them in many places. But in time, these evil ones spawned hellish minions who set about preparing for their return to greatness. The old ones are nameless, but their power is and will apparently always be great enough to check that of others. Now, among the evil ones, there is apparently often conflict, as among lesser beings. The water beings oppose those of air, the fire beings oppose earth beings, but nevertheless they together hate and fear the elder gods, and hope always to defeat them in some future time. So what Derleth is doing here is he is taking the Lovecraftian gods, these unknowable creatures of an inhuman, unimaginable nature, and he's trying to create a pantheon. He's attributing them to the elements, water, earth, fire, and air. He says that the air is the enemies of the water beings, that the fire beings are enemy to earth. These are not Pokemon rules or Avatar rules or whatever. He's just kind of making it up as he goes along. And this is what I said, I think what Derleth tried to do is he tried to take the unknowable and he tried to fit it in a box, but the box had pegs, and he just kept trying to hammer a square peg into a round hole. And rather than accept that the square peg would not fit into the round hole, he grabbed a fucking mallet and jammed it through. We're going to get more into this. Among my Uncle Amos papers, there are many fearsome names written in his crabbed script. Great Cthulhu, the Lake of Holly, Sithagwa, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, Azathoth, Hastur the Unspeakable, Yagath, Aldon's Tail, Aldebaran, the Hades, Carcosa. So these are not just Lovecraft things. These are also things from Bierce. These are things from Chambers. The hate and again, like, it depends on which writer we're going with on what these things are. Like the Hades it's supposed to be a star cluster in the constellation of Taurus. And Aldebaran is a red star that the city of Carcosa is on sometimes. Other times, the city of Carcosa is an earthly city. Sometimes Carcosa exists in another dimension, and sometimes Carcosa is part of the Dreamlands. It all depends on which writer we're citing, and because so many different writers have tried have added on this, it's really hard to to place what exactly is meant when they just willy-nilly name drop these things the way that Derleth is. But it's like, this is a man who's like trying to cram as many Easter eggs in here, and he's and unlike George, who can kind of do it a bit more elegantly, because he has his Easter eggs, like Carcosa is out in the far east, but it's and there's a sorcerer lord who claims to be a yellow emperor of Yiti, and we can make this whole thing like, oh, okay, I see what you're doing, George. That's pretty slick, because that's a King in Yellow reference. A sorcerer lord, Hastur, the 69th yellow emperor of Yiti, the King in Yellow. That's something great. But Derleth's just cramming them all in here. And yes, he's gets sucked in the box and but what's in the box? We're gonna put it. Let's open the box, and I don't know. Do we open the box? Do we see if this cat is alive or dead? You tell me, Schrodinger. All right, we're. God, I get set off on this, and I went off on a tangent. So let's reel it back in, because we're having fun. We're having fun. That's the catchphrase around here, ain't it? We're having fun. Okay, and others. And it is possible to divide some of these names into vaguely suggestive classes from those notes, which are explicable to me, though many present insoluble mysteries I cannot hope as yet to penetrate, and many too are written in a language I do not know, together with cryptic and oddly frightening symbols and signs. But through what I have learned, it is possible to know that great Cthulhu is one of the water beings, even as Hastur is of the beings that stalk the star spaces. And it is possible to gather from vague hints in these forbidden books where some of these beings are. So I can believe that in this mythology, great Cthulhu was banished to a place beneath the seas of earth, while Hastur was hurled into outer space, into that place where the black stars hang, which is indicated as Aldebaran of the Hades, which is the place mentioned by Chambers, even as he repeats the Carcosa of Bierce. He's just forcing his pantheon. But this is where we can get to some Euron talk. So, despite Derleth, my reservations about him trying to create these gods into elementals, he puts on this heirs. So we have Cthulhu as a water being, and we have Hastur as an air being. Now, what we can see from this is, because when we look at the Ironborn, the drowned god is an obvious Cthulhu reference. And Cthulhu's enemy is Hastur, but the drowned god's enemy is the storm god. And one line that Euron famously says when he's called out by Roderick the Reader, "I am the storm, the first and last." What we're seeing here, and what we'll see later on when we get to Tatters of the King, one of the Hastur's most, I'm jumping ahead here, but one of Hastur's biggest actions later in the Cthulhu mythos with Lynn Carter is that Hastur is supposed to be an elder god like Cthulhu, but he leads a rebellion against the other elder gods, and he himself is a god of nihilism, and as well as decadence and disorder. And those are also the things that Euron is thriving on: decadence, disorder. We see that with the taking of the Shield Islands. We see that with Euron. with Euron just sowing chaos and using that chaos as a ladder. That's Littlefinger, but that's what Euron's doing. Euron's sowing chaos, and he's using the Ironborn as a means to an end, which I've said before. What I want to get at here is that Euron Greyjoy is, he's Ironborn, and normally he would be following the religion of the Drowned God, but he doesn't. Euron rejects the Drowned God. He rejects all gods. But what's important with the Drowned God is that's the first god that Euron rejects, which he did after he killed his older brother, the one who had grayscale. He pinched his nose shut. And then Euron goes out and says, I pissed into the sea and waited for the Drowned God to punish me, to smite me. And nothing happened. And so this is where we see Euron's first delves into this nihilism where he rejects the first god of his own culture. But Euron, despite rejecting the Drowned God, cannot escape the fact that he is Ironborn. He is a Greyjoy. Just as Hastur, while he rebels against the Elder Gods and he rebels against Cthulhu, can't change that he is an Elder God himself and that he is related to Cthulhu. And that is why it's like that. This is what really got me onto this whole looking at these parallels of Euron and Hastur. And first and foremost, it starts here with the enmity between the Drowned God and the Storm God, juxtaposed with this enmity between Cthulhu and Hastur. So Derleth doing what he did with making Hastur an air entity and putting him on Aldebaran, the Red Star, and George has the red comet flying in the background. That invokes the idea of the Red Star of Aldebaran. And Hastur rules from Carcosa, which is a city that has two twin suns that sink beneath the Lake of Holly. And the Lake of Holly is it's referred to as a cloud lake. Now, this could mean that, again, depending on the story, when Carcosa is looked at as a city on Earth in one story, usually the Cloud Lake means it's a very misty lake shrouded in fog, which makes it very hard to see. But when Carcosa is an otherworldly city, like on another planet or on a star in another dimension, the Lake of Holly, the Cloud Lake, becomes a swirling vortex of clouds. Like I imagine sort of like you can look at the swirling cloud lake as like the atmosphere on Venus, and that's when Carcosa is supposed to be otherworldly. The other thing about Carcosa is that I think actually I'm going to save this when we read Casilda's song. It'll be better for there when we get more on Carcosa. Jumping ahead there, my apologies. Coming upon this communication from the priests in Tibet in the light of these things, surely one fact must come clearly forth, Haddon. Surely beyond the shadow of doubt, he who is not to be named can be none other than Hastur the Unspeakable. The sudden cessation of his voice startled me. There was something hypnotic about his eager whisper, and something that filled me with a conviction far beyond the power of Paul Tuttle's words. Somewhere deep within the recesses of my mind, a chord had been struck. A mnemonic connection I could not dismiss or trace, and which left me with a feeling as of limitless age, a cosmic bridge into another place and time. That seems logical, I said at last cautiously. Logical? Haddon, it is. It must be, he exclaimed. Granting it, I said. What then? Why, granting it, he went on quickly. We have conceded that my uncle Amos promised to make ready a haven in preparation for the return of Hastur from whatever region of outer space now imprisons him. Where that haven is, or what manner of place it may be, has not thus far been my concern, though I can guess perhaps. This is not the time for guessing, and yet it would seem from certain other evidence at hand that there may be some permissible deductions made. The first and most important of these is of a double nature. Ergo, something unforeseen prevented the return of Hastur within my uncle's lifetime, and yet some other being has made itself manifest. Here he looked at me with unusual frankness, and not a little nervousness. As for the evidence of this manifestation, I would rather not at this time go into it. Suffice it to say that I believe I have such evidence at hand. I return to my original premise then. So many words. Among the few marginal notations made by my uncle, there are 2 or 3 especially remarkable ones in the Ryla text. Indeed, in the light of what is known or can be justifiably guessed, they are sinister and ominous notes. So speaking, he opened the ancient manuscript and turned to a place quite close to the beginning of the narrative. How many pages are left in this story? Now attend me, Hayden, he said, and I rose and bent over him to look at the spidery, almost illegible script that I knew for Amos Tuttle's. Observe the underscored lines of text. Here we go with the Cthulhu chanting. Flogni Magua Cthulhu Ryla Wagla Nekal Fatagan. And what follows it in my uncle's unmistakable hand, his minions preparing the way, and he no longer dreaming. WT 228. And at a more recent date, to judge by the shakiness of his hand, the single abbreviation, INS. Obviously, this means nothing without a translation of the text. Failing this at the moment I first saw this note, I turned my attention to the parenthetical notation and within a short while solved its meaning as a reference to a popular magazine, Weird Tales for February 1928. I have it here. He opened the magazine against the meaningless text, partially concealing the lines which had begun to take on an uncanny atmosphere of eldritch age beneath my eyes, and there beneath Paul Tuttle's hand lay the first page of a story so obviously belonging to this unbelievable mythology that I could not repress a start of astonishment. The title, only partly covered by his hand, was The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. The fourth wall! You're breaking the fourth wall! But Tuttle did not linger over the first page. He turned well into the heart of the story before he paused and presented to my gaze the identical unreadable line that lay beside the crabbed script of Amos Tuttle in the incredibly rare Ryla text, upon which the magazine reposed. And there, only a paragraph below, appeared what purported to be a translation of the utterly unknown language of the text. In his house at Ryla, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. There you have it, resumed Tuttle with some satisfaction. Cthulhu, too, waited for the time of his resurgence. How many eons, no one may know, but my uncle has questioned whether Cthulhu still lies dreaming, and following this has written and doubly underscored an abbreviation which can only stand for Innsmouth. This, together with the ghastly things half hinted in this revealing story, purporting to be only fiction, opens up a vista of undreamed horror, of age-old evil. Good heaven, I exclaimed involuntarily. Surely you can't think this fantasy has come to life. Tuttle turned and gave me a strangely distant look. What I think doesn't matter, Haddon. But there is one thing I would like very much to know. What happened at Innsmouth? What has happened there for decades past that people have shunned it so? Why has this once prosperous port sunk into oblivion, half its houses empty, its property practically worthless? And why was it necessary for government men to blow up row after row of the waterfront dwellings and warehouses? Lastly, for what earthly reason did they send a submarine to torpedo the marine spaces beyond Devil Reef just out of Innsmouth? I know nothing of that, I replied, but he paid no heed. His voice rose a little, uncertain and trembling, and he said, I can tell you, Haddon, it is even as my uncle Amos has written. Great Cthulhu has risen again. For a moment I was shaken. Then I said, but it is Hastur for whom he waited. Precisely, agreed Tuttle in a clipped professorial voice. Then I should like to know who or what it is that walks in the earth in the dark hours when Fomalhaut has risen and the Hades are in the east. With this, he abruptly changed the subject. He began to ask me questions about myself and my practice, and presently, when I rose to go, he asked me to stay the night. This I consented finally, and with some reluctance to do, whereupon he departed at once to make a room ready for me. How many words do you need to say, Derleth, just to tell us that you're staying the night and he's preparing a room for you? I took the opportunity thus afforded to examine his desk more closely for the Necronomicon missing from the library of Miskatonic University. It was not on his desk, but crossing to the shelves, I found it there. I had just taken it down and was examining it to make certain of its identity when Tuttle re-entered the room. His quick eyes darted to the book in my hands, and he half smiled. I wish you'd take that back to Dr. Lanfer when you go to the morning, Hayden. he said casually. Now that I've copied the text, I have no further use for it. I'll do that gladly, I said, relieved that the matter could so easily be settled. Shortly after, I retired to the room on the second floor which he had prepared for me. He accompanied me as far as the door, and there paused briefly, uncertain of speech, ready for his tongue, and yet not permitted to pass his lips. For he turned once or twice, bade me good night before he spoke what weighed upon his thoughts. By the way, if you hear anything in the night, don't be alarmed, Haddon. Whatever it is, it's harmless, as yet. It was not until he had gone and I was alone in my room that the significance of what he had said and the way he had said it dawned upon me. It grew upon me then that this was confirmation of the wild rumors that had penetrated Arkham, and that Tuttle spoke not entirely without fear. I undressed slowly and thoughtfully and got into the pajamas Tuttle had laid out for me, without deviating for an instant from the preoccupation with the weird mythology of Amos Tuttle's ancient books that held my mind. Words, words, words. Why did I think to read this? It does become important for the Euron discussion. I'm just going to try and blitz through this here. Never quick to pass judgment, I was not prone to do so now, despite the apparent absurdity of the structure. It was still sufficiently well erected to merit more than a casual scrutiny, and it was clear to me that Tuttle was more than half convinced of its truth. This in itself was more than enough to give me pause, for Tuttle had distinguished himself time and again for the thoroughness of his researches, and his published papers had not been challenged for even their most minor detail. As a result of facing these facts, I was prepared to admit at least that there was some basis for the mythology structure outlined to me by Tuttle. But as to its truth or error, of course, I was in no position at that time to commit myself, even within the confines of my own mind. For once a man concedes or condemns a thing within his mind, it is doubly, nay triply, difficult to rid himself of this conclusion, however ill-advised it may subsequently prove to be. Thinking thus, I got into bed and lay there awaiting sleep. The night had deepened and darkened, though I could see through the flimsy curtain at the window that the stars were out. Andromeda high in the east, and the constellations of autumn beginning to mount the sky. I just don't want this to turn into a 3.5-hour stream where we don't really get to the meat of it because we're stuck with just cutting through all of this fat. So many words. I was on the edge of sleep when I was startled awake again by a sound which had been present for some time, but which had only just then been borne upon me with all its significance. The faintly trembling step of some gigantic creature vibrating all through the house, though the sound of it came not from within the house, but from the east. And for a confused moment I thought of something risen from the sea and walking along the shore in the wet sand. The illusion passed when I raised myself on one elbow and listened more intently. For a moment there was no sound whatever, and then it came again, irregularly broken, a step, a pause, 2 steps in fairly quick succession, an odd sucking noise. Disturbed, I got up and went to the open window. The night was warm and the air still almost sultry. Far to the northeast a beacon cut an arc upon the sky, and from the distant north came the faint drone of a night plane. It was already past midnight. Low in the east shone red Aldebaran and the Pleiades, but I did not at that time, as I did later, connect the disturbances I heard to the appearance of the Hades above the horizon. The odd sounds, meanwhile, continued unabated, and it was borne in upon me presently that they were indeed approaching the house, however slow the progress. And that they came from the direction of the sea I could not doubt, for in this place there was no configurations of the earth that might have thrown any sound out of directional focus. I began to think again of those similar sounds we had heard while Amos Tuttle's body lay in the house, though I did not then remember that even as the Hades lay now low in the east, so they were then setting in the west. If there were any difference in the manner of their approach, I was not able to ascertain it, unless it was that the present disturbances seemed somehow closer. But it was not a physical closeness as much as a psychic closeness. The conviction of this was so strong that I began to feel a growing uneasiness, not untinged with fear. I began to experience a wild restlessness, a desire for company, and I went quickly to the door of my room, opened it, and stepped quietly into the hall in search of my host. Now at once a new discovery made itself known. As long as I had been in my room, the sounds I had heard seemed unquestionably to come from the east, notwithstanding the faint, almost intangible tremors that seemed to shudder through the old house. But here in the darkness of the hall, whither I had gone without a light of any kind, I became aware that the sounds and tremblings alike emanated from below, not indeed from any place in the house, but below that, rising as if from subterranean places. My nervous tension increased, and I stood uneasily to get my bearings in the dark, when I perceived in the direction of the stairway a faint radiance mounting from below. I moved toward it at once, noiselessly, and looking over the banister, saw that the light came from the electric candle held in Paul Tuttle's hands. He was standing in the lower hall, clad in his dressing gown, though it was clear to me even from where I stood that he had not removed his clothes. The light that fell upon his face revealed the intensity of his attention. His head was cocked a little to one side in an attitude of listening, and he stood motionless the while I looked down upon him. "Paul!" I called in a harsh whisper. He looked up instantly and saw my face, doubtless caught in the light from the candle in his hand. "Do you hear?" he asked. "Yes. What in God's name is it?" "I've heard it before," he said. "Come down." I went down to the lower hall, where I stood for a moment under his penetrating and questioning gaze. "You aren't afraid, Haddon?" I shook my head. "Then come with me." He turned and led the way toward the back of the house, where he descended into the cellar below. At this time, the sounds were rising in volume. It was as if they had approached closer to the house, indeed, almost as if they were directly below. And now there was obvious a definite trembling in the building, not alone of the walls and supports, but one with the shuddering and shaking of the earth all around. It was as if some deep subterranean disturbance had chosen this spot in the earth's surface to make itself manifest. Tuttle was unmoved by this, doubtless for the reason that he had experienced it before. He went directly through the first and second cellars to a third, set somewhat lower than the others, and apparently of more recent construction, but like the first two, built of limestone blocks set in cement. In the center of this sub-cellar, he paused and stood quietly listening. The sounds had by this time risen to such intensity that it seemed as if the house were caught in a vortex of volcanic upheaval, without actually suffering the destruction of its supports. For the trembling and shuddering, the creaking and groaning of the rafters above us gave evidence of the tremendous pressure exerted within the earth beneath us, and even the stone floor of the cellar seemed alive under my bare feet. But presently these sounds appeared to recede into the background, though actually they lessened not at all, and only presented this illusion because of our growing familiarity with them, and because our ears were becoming attuned to other sounds in more major keys, these too rising from below as from a great distance, but carrying them with them an insidious hellishness and the implications that grew upon us. For the first whistling sounds were not clear enough to justify any guess as to origin, and it was not until I had been listening for some time that occurred to me that the sounds breaking into the weird whistling or whimpering derived from something alive, some sentient being, for presently they resolved into uncouth and shocking mouthings, indistinct and not intelligible, even when they could be clearly heard. By this time, Tuttle had put the candle down, had come to his knees, and now lay upon the floor with his ear close to the stone. In obedience to his motion, I did likewise, and found that the sounds from below resolved into more recognizable syllables, though less meaningless. For the first while, I heard nothing but incoherent and apparently unconnected ululations with which were interpolated chanting sounds, which later I put down as follows. Ea, Ea, Shub-Niggurath, Ugh, Cthulhu Fatagan, Ea, Ea, Cthulhu. That I was in some error in regard to at least one of these sounds I soon learned. Cthulhu itself was plainly audible, despite the fury of mounting sound all around, but the word that followed now seemed somewhat longer than Fatagan. It was as if an extra syllable had been added, and yet I could not be certain that it had not been there all the while, for presently it came clearer, and Tuttle took from a pocket his notebook and pencil and wrote, "They are saying, Cthulhu, Naffel Fatagan." Judging by the expression of his eyes, faintly elated, this evidently conveyed something to him, but to me it meant nothing, apart from my ability to recognize a portion of it as identical in character with the words that appeared in the abhorred Ryla text, and subsequently again in the magazine story, where its translation would seem to have indicated that the words meant Cthulhu waits dreaming. My obvious blank ignorance of this meaning apparently recalled to my host that his philological learning was far in excess of mine, for he smiled bleakly and whispered, "It can be nothing else but a negative construction." Even then, I did not at once understand what he meant to explain that the subterranean voices were not saying what I had thought, but Cthulhu no longer waits dreaming. There was now no longer any question of belief, for the things that were taking place were of no human origin, and admitted of no other solution than one in some way, however remotely, related to the incredible mythology Tuttle had so recently expounded to me. And now, as if this evidence of feeling and hearing were not enough, there became manifest a strange fetid smell, mingled with a nauseatingly strong odor of fish, apparently seeping up through the porous limestone. Tuttle became aware of this almost simultaneously with my own recognition, and I was alarmed to observe in his features traces of apprehension stronger than any I had heretofore noticed. He lay for a moment quietly, then he rose stealthily, took up the candle, and crept from the room, beckoning me after him. Only when we were once more on the upper story did he venture to speak. "They are closer than I thought," he said then, musingly. "Is it Hastur?" I asked nervously. He shook his head. "It cannot be he, because the passage below leads only to the sea and is doubtless partly full of water. Therefore, it can only be one of the water beings, those who took refuge there when the torpedoes destroyed Devil Reef beyond Shun Innsmouth, Cthulhu, or those who serve him, as the Migos serve in the icy fastness, and the Cho-Cho people serve on the hidden plateaus of Asia." So, once again, he's just cramming as many Easter eggs in here as he possibly can. Since it was impossible to sleep, we sat for a time in the library, while Tuttle spoke in a half-chanting manner of the strange things he had come upon in the old books that had been his uncle's, sat waiting for the dawn while he told of the dreaded plateau of Leng, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, of Azathoth and Nyarlathotep, the mighty messenger who walked the star spaces in the semblance of a man, of the horrible and diabolic yellow sign, the haunted and fabled towers of mysterious Carcosa, of terrible Ligor and hated Tsar, of Ithaquah, the snow thing, of Chognar Fong and Naga Cthulhu, of unknown Kadath and the fungi from Yagath. So he talked for hours while the sounds below continued, and I sat listening in a deadly terror-fraught fear. Yet that fear was needless, for with the dawn the stars paled, and the tumult below died subtly away, fading toward the east and the ocean's deeps, and I went at last to my room, eagerly to dress in preparation for my leave. In little over a month, I was again on my way to the Tuttle estate via Arkham in response to an urgent card from Paul, upon which he had scrawled in a shaky hand the single word, "Come." Even if he had not written, I should have considered it my duty to return to the old house on the Aylesbury Road, despite my distaste for Tuttle's soul-shaking research and the now active fear I could not help but feel. Still, I'd been holding off ever since coming to the decision that I should attempt to dissuade Tuttle from further research until the morning of the day on which his card came. On that morning, I found in the transcript a garbled story from Arkham. I would not have noticed it at all had it not been for the small head to take the eye. Outrage in Arkham Cemetery, and below, Tuttle Vault violated. The story was brief and disclosed little beyond the information already conveyed by the headings. It was discovered here earlier this morning that vandals had broken into and partly destroyed the Tuttle Vault in Arkham Cemetery. One wall is smashed almost beyond repair, and the coffins have been disturbed. It has been reported that the coffin of the late Amos Tuttle is missing, but confirmation cannot be had by the time this issue goes to press. Immediately upon reading this vague bulletin, I was seized with the strongest apprehension, come upon me from what I know not what source yet. I felt at once that the outrage perpetrated upon the vault was not an ordinary crime, and I could not help connecting it in my mind with the concurrences at the old Tuttle house. I had therefore resolved to go to Arkham, and thence to see Paul Tuttle before his card arrived. His brief message alarmed me still more, if possible, and at the same time convinced me of what I had feared. that some revolting connection existed between the cemetery outrage and the things that walked in the earth beneath the house on Aylesbury Road. But at the same time, I became aware of a deep reluctance to leave Boston, obsessed with an intangible fear of invisible danger from an unknown source. Still, duty compelled my going, and however strongly I might shun it, go I must. I can understand this because driving in Boston is terrible. I arrived in Arkham in early afternoon and went at once to the cemetery in my capacity as solicitor to ascertain the extent of the damage done. A police guard had been established, but I was permitted to examine the premises as soon as my identity had been disclosed. The newspaper account I found had been shockingly inadequate, for the ruin of the Tuttle vault was virtually complete, its coffins exposed to the sun's warmth, some of them broken open, revealing long dead bones. While it was true that Amos Tuttle's coffin had disappeared in the night, it had been found at midday in an open field about 2 miles east of Arkham, too far from the road to have been carried there, and the mystery of its being there was, if anything, deeper now than at the time the coffin had been found, for an investigation had disclosed certain deep indentations set at wide intervals in the earth, some of them as much as 40 feet in diameter. It was as if some monstrous creature had walked there, though I confess that this thought occurred only within my own mind. The impressions in the earth remained a mystery upon which no light was thrown, even by the wildest surmises as to their source. This may have been partly due to the more startling fact that had emerged immediately upon finding the coffin. The body of Amos Tuttle had vanished, and a search of the surrounding terrain had failed to disclose it. So much I learned from the custodian of the cemetery before I had set out long below the Aylesbury Road, refusing to think further about this incredible information until I had spoken with Paul Tuttle. This time my summons at his door was not immediately answered, and I had begun to wonder with some apprehension whether something had happened to him, when I detected a faint scuffling sound beyond the door, and almost immediately heard Tuttle's muffled voice. "Who is it?" "Haddon," I replied, and heard what seemed to be a gasp of relief. The door opened, and it was not until it had closed that I became aware of the nocturnal darkness of the hall, and saw that the window at the far end had been tightly shuttered, and that no light fell into the long corridor from any of the rooms opening off of it. I forbore to ask the question that came to my tongue, and turned instead to Tuttle. It was some time before my eyes had mastered the unnatural darkness sufficiently to make him out, and then I was conscious of a distinct feeling of shock, for Tuttle had changed from a tall, upright man in his prime to a bent, heavy man of uncouth and faintly repulsive appearance, betraying an age which actually was not his, and his first words filled me with high alarm. "Quick now, Haddon," he said. "There's not much time." "What is it? What's wrong, Paul?" I asked. He disregarded this, leading the way into the library, where an electric candle burned dimly. "I've made a packet of some of my uncle's most valuable books, the Ryla texts, the Book of Iban, and the Narcotic manuscripts, some others. These must go to the library of Miskatonic University by your hand today without fail. They have henceforth to be considered the property of the library. And here is an envelope containing certain instructions to you in case I fail to get in touch with you either personally or by telephone, which I have had installed here since your last visit, by 10 o'clock tonight. You are staying, I assume, at the Lewiston house. Now attend me closely. If I fail to telephone you to the contrary before 10 o'clock tonight, you are to follow the instructions herein contained without hesitation. I advise you to act immediately, and since you may feel them too unusual to proceed swiftly, I have already telephoned Judge Wilton and explained that I've left some strange but vital instructions with you, but I want them carried out to the letter." "What's happened, Paul?" I asked. For a moment it seemed as if he would speak freely, but he only shook his head and said, "As yet I do not know all, but this much I can say. We have both, my uncle and I, made a terrible mistake, and I fear it is now too late to rectify it. You have learned of the disappearance of Uncle Amos's body." I nodded. "It has since turned up. I was astounded, since I had only just come from Arkham, and no such intelligence had been imparted to me." "Impossible!" I exclaimed. "They are still searching." "Ah, no matter," he said oddly. "It is not there. It is here at the foot of the garden, where it was abandoned when it was found useless." At this he jerked his head up suddenly, and we heard the shuffling and grunting sound that came from somewhere in the house, but in a moment it died away, and he turned again to me. "The Haven," he muttered, and gave a sickly laugh. "The tunnel was built by Uncle Amos, I am sure. but it was not the haven Hastur wanted, though it serves the minions of his half-brother, Great Cthulhu. It was almost impossible to realize that the sun shone outside, for the murkiness of the room and the atmosphere of impending dread that hung over me combined to lend to the scene an unreality part from the world from which I had just come, despite the horror of the violated vault. I perceived also about Tuttle an air of almost feverish expectancy coupled with a nervous haste. His eyes shone oddly and seemed more prominent than I had previously known them. His lips seemed to have coarsened and thickened, and his beard had become matted to a degree I would not have thought possible. He listened now only for a moment before he turned back to me. I myself need to stay for the present. I have not finished mining the place, and that must be done. He resumed erratically, but went on before the questions that rose in me could find utterance. I've discovered that the house rests upon a natural artificial foundation, that below the place must be not only the tunnel, but a mass of cavernous structures, and I believe that these caverns are for the most part water-filled and perhaps inhabited. He added as a sinister afterthought, but this, of course, is at the present time of small importance. I have no immediate fear of what is below, but what I know is to come. You know, this is actually starting to sound a lot like the Winterfell crypts and the caverns that, if we go back to the stream that I did with David Lightbringer on the Crypts of Winterfell, where we talk about the caverns. We probably missed at 10:20. We missed a 4:20 somewhere in the world. But yeah, so the cavern. So we have these water-filled caverns below the house that may or may not be inhabited by some kind of eldritch being. And we're seeing this in A Song of Ice and Fire at the caverns, both that could be inhabited by otherworldly beings. We know the children of the forest are down there with Bloodraven in his abyss. And there's also a chance that whites are going to penetrate Winterfell through the caverns, if not the others themselves. There's also the idea of the weirwood net, the others traveling through the trees. So this is like the type of things we're invoking. Another thing here that it invokes the idea of Amos's Tuttle's body being stolen, but that it isn't quite useful for what's happening. And that's the idea that Jon's body could be stolen by the others. That's another thing that we discussed in the Crypts of Winterfell. We've had this. There's been the theory that Jon's body will be otherized for at least for a short time before he's actually brought back. And I've had this idea of this tug of war over Jon's body between the others magic, the fire magic of Melisandre, and the green magic of Bran, like a three-way tug of war of green, red, and blue magic, ice, fire, and green seer magic, and how Jon will, because of this tug of war over Jon's body, Jon symbolically becoming the trident where his father Rhaegar died. Now the thing is that if that theory ends up being true, if Jon's body is otherized but is eventually wrestled back, either by through like a combination of Melisandre or Bran or wherever it is, whatever it is that allows for Jon to come back from the others are still going to need a replacement. And this is where the idea that Euron Greyjoy and that he might become the great other, that he might be otherized because of his attempts, because he's essentially playing with fire. Like Euron Greyjoy is attempting to become a god. I've called it, he's trying to open the chaos door, are the words that I've been using, with what he's currently doing at Old Town, the sacrifices of priests and holy men, and King's Blood, and the whole maelstrom of just blood and violence that's going to happen in Old Town, possibly summoning Krakens. You know, these are the days the world will be remade in the charnel pits. Like this is what we're going at. And I mean, it should become, if it's not been made obvious where Derleth's going here. Amos Tuttle's deal was that Hastur was supposed to take over his body, but he died before that. So, but you know what? A deal was made and a price is going to be paid. And that's ultimately where we're going here. Once again, he paused to listen, and again, vague, distant sounds came to our ears. I listened intently, hearing an ominous fumbling as if some creature were trying a door, and strove to discover or guess at its origin. I had thought at first that the sound emanated from somewhere within the house, thought almost instinctively of the attic, for it seemed to come from above. But in a moment it was borne in upon me that the sound did not derive from any place within the house, nor yet from any portion of the house outside, but grew some place beyond that, from a point in space beyond the walls of the house. A fumbling, plucking noise, which was not associated in my consciousness with any recognizable material sounds, but was rather an unearthly invasion. I peered at Tuttle and saw that his attention was also for something from outside, for his head was somewhat lifted and his eyes looked upon the enclosing walls, bearing in them a curiously rapt expression, not without fear, nor yet without a strange air of helpless waiting. "This is Hastur's sign," he said in a hushed voice. "When the Hyades rise and the Aldebaran stalks the sky tonight, he will come. The other will be here with his watery people, those of the primal guild races." Then he began to laugh, suddenly, soundlessly, and with a sly, half-mad glance at it. "And Cthulhu and Hastur shall struggle here for the haven while great Orion strides above the horizon, while Betelgeuse, where the elder gods are, who alone can block the evil designs of this hellish spawn." My astonishment at his words doubtless showed in my face, and in tune made me understand what shocked hesitation and doubt I felt. For abruptly his expression altered, his eyes softened, his hands clasped and unclasped nervously, and his voice became more natural. "But perhaps this tires you, Hayden," he said. "I will say no more, for the time grows short, the evening approaches, and in a little while the night. I beg you to have no question about following the instructions I have outlined in this brief note for your eyes. I charge you to follow my directions implicitly. If it is as I fear, even they may be of no avail. If it is not, I shall reach you in time." With that, he picked up the packet of books, placed it in my hands, and led me to the door, whither I followed him without protest, for I was bewildered and not a little unmanned at the strangeness of his actions, the uncanny atmosphere of brooding horror that clung to the ancient menace-ridden house. At the threshold, he paused briefly and touched my arm lightly. "Goodbye, Hayden," he said, with friendly intensity. Then I found myself on the stoop in the glare of the lowering sunlight so bright that I closed my eyes against it until I could again accustom myself to its brilliance. With the cheerful chortle of a late bluebird on a fence post across the road sounded pleasantly in my ears, as if to belie the atmosphere of dark fear and eldritch horror behind. I come now to that portion of my narrative upon which I am loath to embark, not alone because of the credibility of what I must write, but because it can be at best as a vague, uncertain account, replete with surmises and remarkable, if disjointed evidence of horror-torn, eon-old evil beyond time, of primal things that lurk just outside the pale of life we know, or terrible animate survival in the hidden places of earth. How much of this Tuttle learned from those hellish texts he entrusted to my care for the locked shelves of Miskatonic University Library, I cannot say. Certain it is that he guessed many things he did not know until too late of others. He gathered hints, though it is to be doubted that he fully comprehended the magnitude of the task upon which he so thoughtlessly embarked when he sought to learn why Amos Tuttle had willed the deliberate destruction of his house and books. Oh, we are almost done. Following my return to Arkham's ancient streets, events succeeded events with undesirable rapidity. I deposited Tuttle's packet of books with Dr. Lanfer at the library and made my way immediately after to Judge Wilton's house, where I was fortunate enough to find him. He was just sitting down to supper and invited me to join him, which I did, though I had no appetite for any kind. Indeed, food seemed repugnant to me. By this time, all the fears and intangible doubts I had held had come to a head within me, and Wilton saw at once that I was laboring under an unusual nervous strain. "Curious thing about the Tuttle Vault, isn't it?" he ventured shrewdly, guessing at the reason for my presence in Arkham. "Yes, but not half so curious as the circumstances Amos Tuttle's body reposing at the foot of his garden," I replied. "Indeed," he said, without any visible sign of interest, his calmness serving to restore in me some measure of a sense of tranquility. "I dare say you've come from there and know whereof you speak." At that, I told him as briefly as possible the story I had come to tell, omitting only a few of the more improbable details, but not entirely succeeding in dismissing his doubts, though he was far too much a gentleman to permit me to feel them. He sat for a while in thoughtful silence after I had finished, glancing once or twice at the clock, which showed the hour to be already past 7. Presently, he interrupted his reverie to suggest that I telephone the Lewiston house and arrange for any call for me to be transferred to Judge Wilton's home. This I did instantly, somewhat relieved that he had consented to take the problem seriously enough to devote his evening to it. As for the mythology, he said, directly upon my return to the room, it can be dismissed as the creation of a mad mind, the Arab Abdul al-Hazred. I say advisedly it can be, but in the light of the things which have happened at Innsmouth, I should not like to commit myself. However, we are not at present in session. The immediate concern is for Paul Tuttle himself. I propose that we examine his instructions to you forthwith. I produced the envelope at once and opened it. It contained but a single sheet of paper, bearing these cryptic and ominous lines. I have mined the house and all. Go immediately without delay to the pasture gate west of the house, where in the shrubbery on the right side of the lane as you approach from Arkham, I have concealed the detonator. My Uncle Amos was right. It should have been done in the first place. If you fail me, Haddon, then before God you loose upon the countryside such a scourge as man has never known and will never see again, if indeed he survives it. Some inkling of the cataclysmic truth must at that moment have begun to penetrate my mind, for when Judge Wilton leaned back, looked at me quizzically and asked, "What are you going to do?" I replied without hesitation, "I'm going to follow the instructions to the letter." He gazed at me for a moment without comment, then he bowed to the inevitable and settled back. "We shall wait for 10 o'clock together," he said gravely. The final act of the incredible horror that had its focal point in the Tuttle house took place just a little before 10, coming upon us at the beginning in so disarmingly prosaic a manner that the full horror, when it came, was doubly shocking and profound. For at 5 minutes to 10, the telephone rang. Judge Wilton took it at once, and even from where I sat, I could hear the agonized voice of Paul Tuttle calling my name. This is I just realized I keep switching this dude's name from Haddon to Hayden, back to Haddon, and back to Hayden. I like Hayden better, so I'm going to stick with Hayden. "This is Hayden," I said with a calmness I did not feel. "What is it, Paul?" "Do it now," he cried. "Oh, God, Hayden, right away before, too late. Oh, God, the Haven, the Haven. You know the place. Pasture Gate. Oh, God, be quick." Then there happened what I shall never forget, the sudden, terrible degeneration of his voice, so that it was as if he had crumpled altogether and sank into abysmal mouthings, for the sounds that came over the wire were bestial and inhuman, shocking gibberings and crude, brutish, drooling sounds, from among which certain of them recurred again and again, and I listened in steadily mounting horror to the triumphant gibbering before it died away. "Ea, Ea, Hastur, ugh, Ea, Hastur, Safafalak Viltong, Viltong, I, Shabnigaroth, Hastur, Kithal Ea, Hastur." I don't think I said any of that right. Only the Eas and the Fatogans I know for sure. I come for the Eas and I stay for the Fatogans. Then abruptly all sound died away, and I turned to face Judge Wilton's terror-stricken features. And yet I did not see him, nor did I see anything in my understanding of what must be done, for abruptly, with cataclysmic effect, I understood what Tuttle had failed to know until too late. And at once I dropped the telephone. At once I ran hatless and coatless from the house into the street, with the sound of Judge Wilton frantically summoning police over the telephone fading into the night behind me. I ran with unnatural speed from the shadowed, haunted streets of witch-cursed Arkham into the October night, down the Aylesbury Road, into the lane and the pasture gate, where for one brief instant, while sirens blew behind me, I saw the Tuttle house through the orchard, outlined in a hellish purple glow, beautiful but unearthly and tangibly evil. Then I pushed down the detonator, and with a tremendous roar, the old house burst asunder, and flames leaped up from where the house had stood. For a few dazed moments I stood there, aware suddenly of the arrival of police along the road south of the house, before I began to move up to join them, and so saw that the explosion had brought about what Paul Tuttle had hinted, the collapse of the subterranean caverns below the house, for the land itself was settling, slipping down, and the flames that had risen were hissing and steaming in the water gushing up from below. Then it was that other thing happened, the last unearthly horror that mercifully blotted out what I saw and the wreckage jutting out above the rising waters. The great protoplasmic mass risen from the center of the lake, forming where the Tuttle house had been, and the thing that came crying out to us across the lawn before it turned to face that other and begin a titanic struggle for mastery, interrupted only by the brilliant explosion of light that seemed to emanate from the eastern sky like a bolt of incredibly powerful lightning. So what we're seeing here is basically Cthulhu fighting Hastur. And the language that's being used with the sky-like bolts of incredibly powerful lightning, the water churning, the flames rising. I came for the I stay for the photography. If I ever do merch, that could be one, along with the whole get gray wasted thing. But yeah, so this battle between Hastur and Cthulhu, we can imagine this as being like a battle between the drowned god and the storm god of the Ironborn religion. And like Euron says, he is the storm, the first and the last. Before lightning-like appendages descended from the heart of the blinding pillar of light itself, one seizing the mast in the waters, lifting it high and casting it far out to sea, the other taking that second thing from the lawn and hurling it a dark dwindling blot into the sky where it vanished among the eternal stars. And then came sudden absolute cosmic silence, and where a moment before this miracle of light had been, there was now only darkness and the line of trees against the sky, and low in the east the gleaming eye of Betelgeuse as Orion rose into the autumn night. For an instant I did not know which was worse, the chaos of the previous moment or the utter black silence of the present. But the small cries of horrified men brought it back to me, and it was borne in upon me that they at least did not understand the secret horror, the final thing that sears and maddens, the thing that rises in the dark hours to stalk the bottomless depths of the mind. They may have heard, as I did, that thin, far whistling sound, that maddening ululation from the deep, immeasurable gulf of cosmic space, the wailing that fell back along the wind, and the syllables that floated down the slopes of air. Tekelili, tekelili, tekelili. Certainly they saw the thing that came crying out at us from the sinking ruins behind, the distorted caricature of a human being, with its eyes sunk into invisibility and thick masses of scaly flesh, the thing that flailed its arms bonelessly at us like the appendages of an octopus, the thing that shrieked and gibbered in Paul Tuttle's voice. But they could not know the secret that I alone knew, the secret Amos Tuttle might have guessed in the shadows of his dying hours, the thing Paul Tuttle was too late in learning, that the haven sought by Hastur the Unspeakable, the haven promised him who is not to be named, was not the tunnel and not the house, but the body and soul of Amos Tuttle himself, and failing these, the living flesh and immortal soul of him who lived in that doom house on the Aylesbury Road. So that's the return of Hastur. And as you can see, it ends with Paul Tuttle being possessed by Amos. I mean, possessed by Hastur, because Amos' body was unusable. And what I find, it becomes reminiscent of the dreams that Euron Damphair is having in The Forsaken. If we look at Paul Tuttle coming out with the sunken eyes and the tentacled face, and we juxtapose that with lines from The Forsaken, which we can read here. So let me open my link. The dreams were even worse the second time. He saw the long ships of the Ironborn adrift and burning on a boiling blood-red sea. He saw his brother on the Iron Throne again, but Euron was no longer human. He seemed more squid than man, a monster fathered by a kraken of the deep, his face a mass of writhing tentacles. Beside him stood a shadow in woman's form, long and tall and terrible, her hands alive with pale white fire. Dwarves capered for their amusement, male and female, naked and misshapen, locked in carnal embrace, biting and tearing at each other as Euron and his mate laughed and laughed and laughed. Euron dreamed of drowning too, not of the bliss that would surely follow down in the drowned god's watery halls, but of the terror that even the faithful feel as the water fills their mouths and nose and lungs, and they cannot draw a breath. 3 times the damp hair woke, and 3 times it proved no true waking, but only another chapter in a dream. But at last there came a day when the door of the dungeon swung open. A mute came splashing through with no hood in his hands. Instead, he had a ring of keys in one hand and a lantern in the other. The light was too bright to look upon, and Euron was afraid of what it meant. Bright and terrible. Something has changed. Something has happened. So, just want to collect my thoughts for a moment here. Actually, we're just going to move on to Casilda's song. We have the return of Hastur. Like, we've laid the groundwork for what exactly Hastur is, and where is Casilda's song? I do just want to read this poem quick. Casilda's song. All right. Along the shore, the cloud waves break. The twin suns sink beneath the lake. The shadows lengthen in Carcosa. Strange is the night where black stars rise, and strange moons circle through the skies. But stranger still is lost Carcosa. Songs that the Haiti shall sing, where flap the tatters of the king, must die unheard in dim Carcosa. Song of my soul, my voice is dead. Die thou unsung as tears unshed, shall dry and die in lost Carcosa. Now, the thing about Carcosa is it's not, George's version of Carcosa is not terribly important to the story, obviously, because we're never going to go that far east. But when we think of Carcosa through the poem, the way that it's described, it seems more akin to a shy. And the idea of the twin suns makes it's not something that we have in Planetos, or the world that we know, the world of ice and where the stories take place. But there is the Carthian legend of the 2 moons. That one moon wandered too close and kissed the sun and cracked open like an egg, and that is how dragons pour. So Carcosa, as it is written, seems more like a parallel to George's version of a shy. And a shy is another place where we know that there are hidden texts, things that someone like Leighton Hightower would want, things that something like Roderick the Reader would want, things that something that Euron Greyjoy may have had access to, if we believe that he's actually been to a shy. Now, I actually do believe that Euron has been to a shy, and I believe that he's been to Karth, the whole Urathon Nightwalker thing. I've said before, I don't really think Euron actually went into Valyria. I think that he probably, paddled around the waters out there and sent his mutes in to go get some stuff, but I don't see him actually going into Valyria. Now, the reason that I wanted to do this stream is during my stream with David Lightbringer, during the 5 Forts and Beyond, when I had first started talking about this idea of Hastur and the King in Yellow and Euron, there was a comment, and I felt I needed to go, and I wanted to elaborate more upon it, where someone had talked about the scene in the play The King in Yellow, where there is it's a ball. The Queen Casilda is there with her daughter Camilla, And Casilda and the stranger appears. The stranger is the king in yellow, and he wears a robe and he wears his pallid mask. And at the ball, the Queen Casilda tells him to remove his mask, to which he replies, "I wear no mask," in which they all aghast. "No mask, no mask." And someone has said, this is supposed to be Euron. But I want to set the scene here because they're never a one-to-one, like when we do these parallels, they're never a perfect one-to-one ratio. So, but I do want to set the scene here where the whole king in yellow idea comes up with Euron. Because when we first hear of Euron, like Euron is through Theon when he first returns to the Iron Islands, and he notes that the silence is not at dock. So even before he is on page, Euron is already looming large over the story. And again, we hear of him at the party before the King's Moot. This is the party where we see Asha Greyjoy schmoozing, trying to get her, and he's trying to get support. And when it becomes evident that she's not going to get enough support to win the King's Moot, she then pivots to trying to get Victarion to make her his hand of the king. And Victarion gets confused and thinks she's that she's suggesting a marriage license. And then he gets a boner thinking about banging his own niece. Great job, Victarion. At the same thing, Aeron Damphair is also doing his best to play politic and to prevent Euron from winning this King's Moot. Now, this party is who's invited to this party. It's the high ups of the Ironborn. Now, granted, the Ironborn are not the most refined of people. You know, this is not a Lannister party. This is not a Tyrell party, but this is the high nobility of the Ironborn. And there's this, and so we have this party where Asha's schmoozing, and Euron's in the background. And he's picking up people later on that we'll see that will become his supporters, like Left Hand Lucas Cod, the Red Ordsman, Brown Tooth, that kind of thing. So Euron, even though he's not on page, he's still also doing his own schmoozing, building up his own alliances and all that before the King's Moot actually happens. And again, this is a party. This is the high nobility of the Ironborn, as noble as the Ironborn can be. And, you know, there's feasting, there's drinking. They're playing the finger game where everyone's tossing axes at each other and losing fingers. And this is what we see before the King's Moot. So then we get to the King's Moot, and first, we I just want to read this line because it's where's my copy of A Feast for Crows? Okay, I have this present. So the first person to speak at the King's Moot is Lord Gilbert Farwind, and the Farwinds are considered like crazy even among the Ironborn. Like they live on the far reaches of the Iron Islands. As far west as we get is their place of lonely light. The only thing we know even further west would be the 3 islands named for Aegon and his sisters. Unless, of course, because we don't know if there's a America's continents blocking the way, or if sailing west will eventually lead to the far east. So, but what Lord Gilbert does is he speaks of sailing west across the Sunset Sea to rich lands and plunder. And I find this interesting because we have, in the discussion that Dave and I did in the Five Forces and Beyond, we talked about this idea of first men of the East because of the fact that first men is so ambiguous. It's not like Andals or Rhoynar that can be traced back to a geographic region. Like the Andals can be traced back to Andalos, and the Rhoynar can be traced back to the river, to the Rhoyne. First men it's very vague. It sounds like they could have came from anywhere. And we have evidence of people coming from the east. Your House Danes, your House Hightowers. We see that with the Blackstone structures on Battle Isle. And then in the Iron Islands, there's also the Seastone Chair. Now, most of the maesters try and chalk up the Ironborn as just being another clan of first men that made it to the Iron Islands. But the Ironborn reject this notion. They say they came from the sea. And what I think is Gilbert Farwin and the Farwins as a whole, he might actually be picking up on some old forgotten knowledge that the Ironborn have forgotten, that maybe there is something out west, and it's probably the east. It's probably the eastern shores of Essos, wherever the map cuts off, the shores of far Mosavie, and perhaps even Carcosa, because that's where the map cuts off. In fact, I want to share. Let me share the screen. First, let me bring up the photo. Where is it? Okay, so let's see. Share screen. Share. Oops. Share screen. Yeah, the Siberian land bridge. That's I'm of the belief George has said that there is no connection between Essos and Westeros. Like there's no land bridge, but he's never specified what exactly is separating them. Is it something as huge as an ocean? Is it a sea? Is it a river? And the thing about that is if it's something that's just like a river or even a small sea, if the temperatures are cold enough, and if the others are actually making their way not only down south, but also going up further north in the other direction, if they were to freeze that, they could possibly freeze that over, creating an ice bridge leading into places like Mosavie and the Grey Waste. So that's... There we go. I'm sorry. I'm still learning how to do this. I'm kind of learning on the fly. Okay, so here's the map of the Far East. And this is where you can see, like, this is where the map cuts off right here past Carcosa. And the thing about George's Carcosa is it sits just just above the Shadowlands, like actually in the far northeastern reaches. It actually looks like it could actually be part of the Shadowlands, because where Carcosa lies is just where we're seeing the Black Mountains end and the sunlight sort of opening up. And Carcosa sits on the Hidden Sea, and this is where I think where George is having a little bit of fun with these Easter eggs, because the Hidden Sea, you can see, like, Carcosa sits on the Hidden Sea, and it's nestled in between this mountain range. There's mountains here, and then there's also a mountain range here going north of it, circling around the Hidden Sea, through the city of the Wingmen, and back down, looping around down into the Shadowlands. And the Lake of Holly is, when it's called a cloud lake, when it's on Earth, that's usually because of high mists and fog that make the lake hard to see. So I think what George is referring to with the Hidden Sea is I believe he's referencing the Lake of Holly. The Hidden Sea could mean not just the Hidden Sea because of how far remote it is, being this far east, but also because of mists and fogs that would be shrouding it across, with Carcosa being nestled into these mountain passes. What's also interesting is that when we think of dragons, there are, along with the 14 Flames of Valyria, we're also told about some other spots where dragons may have come from are the Shadowlands and the islands in the Jade Sea, and that would include Marahai, the Manticore Isles, and the Isle of Lang. And in Lovecraft's fiction, and later picked up through Derleth and his Hastur stories, there are two dragonic creatures, the Bayaki and the Shantok. And I actually have pictures of them, so let me bring up the pictures of the Shantok and the Bayaki. Share screen. Okay, so this is the Bayaki. This is by Ignacio Bazan Lezano. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. I want to give all any artwork I use. I want to make sure I'm giving credit to the artist. But this is a Bayaki, and you can see the king in yellow riding on top of him. And the Bayaki are described as black-furred, bat-winged, iron-beaked. They're like a cross between a bat, a bird, a dragon, and a corpse. And this makes us think of like these Valyrian blood rituals when they're creating these chimeras and like the flesh pits, because that's also probably something that comes out of the great empire of the dawn, when the people of the shadow come to teach the people of Valyria how to ride dragons. It's also, if they're giving them that knowledge, then there's also a good chance that they're also giving the Valyrians the knowledge of how to work these work these flesh pots, these charnel pits, the things that Euron talks of later when the world will be remade and reborn. And then, so that's the Bayaki. But the Bayaki, but the thing about the Bayaki is that they nest primarily in Carcosa. There's huge swaths of them. They roost along the shores of Lake Holly. And we had just said when we were looking at the map, Carcosa looks like it could be on the fringes of the Shadowlands, and maybe even part of the Shadowlands proper because of where they come. So it does seem like Carcosa, where George has it nestled, it would be, along with the rest of the Shadowlands, one of these spots where wild dragons could still roost. The other dragonic creature that I want to bring up are the Shantok, which live in Lovecraftian fiction, live on Lang. So let me bring up that picture. The Shantok. Share. Share screen. I keep clicking the wrong. No. Share screen. So this is the Shantok, and this art is by Loic Muzi. And the Shantok are a dragonic creature that also has the head of a horse, and they live in Lang. And George's Lang sits in the Jade Sea, nestled with these other isles. So we can bring up that map too. I'm starting to have too many tabs open. Share screen. Yeah, so here we have the Jade Sea and the islands. There's Marahai. That is the crescent island that sits between two active volcanoes. We have the Manticore Isles, and we have Lang. So, and these are the other places. These are the other spot where we're told that dragons may have originated in. And Lang is kind of a hot spot for a lot of things. There's because not only would that imply dragons, like but it would also, but they also have the deep ones, the old ones, squishers, and green men, green horn men. And so, and that's what I meant, like, for more info, to get more information on that, because we don't really have time to go that, I would say go watch David Lightbringer's Green Men, the Holy Men of Leng, the Green Men of Leng, and also to go check out the Nimble Dick Squisher Hunt video. Okay. And so we'll move that. All right, and like I said, and the other thing I want to say about Lord Gilbert is that when he does a speech, whenever I think, because of the name Gilbert, I just think of Gilbert Gottfried. So when I read A Song of Ice and Fire, when I read A Feast for Crows, and Lord Gilbert is making his Kingsmoot speech, it's like, "Make me your king, and I shall lead you there. We will build 10,000 ships as Nymeria once did." That's just me. That's just me going on a joke. But okay, so but back to the scene at hand. So we have the Kingsmoot, and obviously Gilbert Farwin doesn't win, and then we get to Eric Ironmaker. His one, he's got a bit more support. Asha's got some support, but not enough, obviously, to win this thing. And then there's Victarion, and Victarion's doing pretty well up until we get the blast of that dragon horn, and then that's where we see and then that's when Euron comes up and he does his whole "make the Iron Islands great again" speech. But what's reminiscent of that makes Euron reminiscent of the King in Yellow here is that Euron is wearing a mask in a way, and his both literally and symbolically, his mask is his eye patch. Because remember, Euron Greyjoy has two eyes. Like, he's not missing an eye. He has two eyes. He has his blue eye, his smiling eye. That's the eye that people see. But then there is his blood eye, the black bruised eye that shines with malice. That's the one that he keeps beneath his eye patch. So that's Euron's mask. He's masking his blood eye, but Euron is also masking his true intent, because the Kingsmoot speech that he gives to not just take the Iron Islands, to not just take the North, to not just take Lannisport and the Arbor and the Shield Islands, but to take all of Westeros. Yeah, that's true. That is a part of his plan, but it's not the full plan. Euron Greyjoy does not tell the Ironborn his true intent, like to take Westeros, because the Seastone Share is not his end goal, and even the Iron Throne is not his end goal, because what Euron wants is the world. Euron wants to become a god, and so Euron is masking his true intent from the rest of the Ironborn. In fact, the only times that Euron is more truthful about the Ironborn is in the Reaver, where he has his conversation with Victarion about how do we know if we cannot fly unless we take some giant leap, where he's alluding to these ideas of greater grandeur. And then Victarion does that line, "Well, there's the window, leap." So I don't like Victarion as a character, because, but I do love Victarion chapters. They're some of the funnest to read. The other time, though, where Euron is being more truthful with his end goals is in the Forsaken chapter. But Euron only tells this to the Damp Hair in private, down in the Hall of the Silence. He's not telling this even to his lackeys, like Left Hand Lucas Codd and the Red Oarsman, because when they drag the Damp Hair out of the hall, when they drag him out and back up to the top of the silence just to tie him to the prow. They even say we've making many sacrifices to the drowned god, like the drowned god's feasting today. Euron is using the religion of the Ironborn as a means to an end. He's not telling them his real goals, but he is telling the damp hair and the privacy down there. But he's doing it as a way of mocking the damp hair. He is using the religion that Euron holds so dearly, and Euron is uses it just to mock him by telling him that, you know, that he will, that about how he'll be a god. And I just want to, the lines from the Forsaken are so good. So let's actually just read those. So where is my Google? I lost my document. Where is my Google Doc? I can see what Dave says about having too many tabs open. All right. Okay, so they drag Euron up to the front. So here's where, have your gods been good to you in the dark? Asked Left Hand Lucas Cod. One of the warlocks snarled some answer in his ugly Eastern tongue. I curse you all, Euron said. Your curses have no power here, priest, said Left Hand Lucas Cod. The crow's eye has fed your drowned god well, and he has grown fat with sacrifice. Words are wind, but blood is power. We have given thousands to the sea, and he has given us victories. Count yourself blessed, Damp Hair, said Stonehand. We are going back to sea. The red wine fleet creeps towards us. The winds have been against them rounding Dorne, but they're finally near enough to have emboldened the old women in Old Town. So now Leighton Hightower's sons move down the Whispering Sound in hopes of catching us in the rear. And then they make a rape joke at Euron's expense, which is fucking great. Terrible. It's real. See, Euron's a great villain, but he's a hard character to truly like because of that. Like, Euron starts out as fun evil, but then we get to the Forsaken and he just becomes evil. Like the No Godless Men speech that's in A Feast for Crows is a great speech, but the Forsaken is just horrifying here. But anyway, so Euron's mask is both, like I said, it's both symbolic and physical, and it's that eye patch, and it's the hiding of his true intent. It's the hiding of what it is he actually wants, and what Euron wants is to become a god, and he is essentially waging a war against not just Westeros, but Euron is waging a war against the gods. He mocks the drowned god. He mocks the gods of all the people, of all the others from Ib when he has that scene. So we're just gonna read the No Godless Man speech. We shall have no king, but from the king's moot the damp hair stood. No godless man may sit the sea stone chair. Euron glanced about the tent. As it happens, I have oft sat upon the sea stone chair of late. It raises no objections. His smiling eye was glittering. Who knows more of gods than I? Horse gods and fire gods, gods made of gold with gemstone eyes, gods carved of cedar wood, gods chiseled into mountains, gods of empty air. I know them all. I have seen their peoples garland them with flowers and shed the blood of goats and bulls and children in their names. And I have heard their prayers in 100 tongues. Cure my withered leg, make the maiden love me, grant me a healthy son, save me, succor me, make me wealthy, protect me from mine enemies, protect me from the darkness, protect me from the crabs inside my belly, from the horse lords, from the slavers, from the sellswords at my door, protect me from the silence. He laughed. Godless, Why, Euron, I am the godliest man ever to raise sail. You serve one god, damp hair, but I have served 10,000. From Ib to Ashai, when men see my sails, they pray. The priest raised a bony finger. They pray to trees and golden idols and goat-headed abominations. False gods. Just so, said Euron, and for that sin I killed them all. I spill their blood upon the sea and sow their screaming women with my seed. Their little gods cannot stop me, so plainly they are false gods. I am more devout than even you, Euron. Perhaps it should be you who kneels to me for blessing. It's so good. It's such a good speech. But the connection here with Hastur, and this is where we're going to get into when we get with the next one, we're going to read Tatters of the King, and that's where we're going to end for the night, is Hastur leads a rebellion against the elder gods. And in a way, Euron is leading a rebellion against the drowned god, but also all of the gods in his attempts to become a god all of his own. And that's where the true King and Yellow thing parallels with Euron in the guise of the play, where with the pallid mask, we envision that the eye patch is the pallid mask in this case. Again, it's not a perfect one-to-one cohesion, but you can see the elements that George is picking up on from the King and Yellow stories, from the Chamber stories, and you can also see the elements that he's picking up on with Carcosa acting as a shy parallel, and then same with another Lovecraftian city, which would be Yuggoth, where the Goth great tiers of terrace towers built of black stone, black rivers of pitch flow under those mysterious cyclopean bridges. Again, like a lot of this is all very Ashai remnant when we think of like the black oily stone that the buildings of Ashai are made of, and the black river ash, and how it but then glows green, and the phosphorus lights. In fact, before we jump to that, we are going to, let me just share another piece of artwork, some more artwork, because I just think these are pretty cool. This is if I bring it up, so here we can see this is the city of Goth. This is by Georgios Tolsis, and you can see like the black stone, the cyclopean bridges, and then this black river of pitch, which also kind of looks like it's on fire. Another one is, and then there is, where did I put it? Oh. This is Lost Cart. This one, next one is going to be share screen, Chrome tab. So this is Lost Carcosa by Laura Mazza, and you can see like how Carcosa is also in this piece of artwork. Carcosa is also reminiscent of Ashai with these black tiered buildings, and you see the two suns that circle Carcosa like black stars. And again, like when we're talking about going back to the two moons, the myth of the two moon, the legend of the two moons, that how one wandered close to the sun. If we go back to before that, if we take that story and we take it to be, yeah, black hole sun, won't you come wash away the rain? But anyway, if we were to take that as literal, and let's say, because it could be possible, if before the long night and before that second moon wandered too close to the sun and cracked open and rained. And either if we take the story as literal and that released dragons, or if we take it more on the more idea of what would happen if a moon really cracked, which would you'd have meteor showers of moon debris, and that's obviously I'm alluding to David Lightbringer's moon meteor theory, and the idea that the dragons in question raining down that spurred from the moon are actually meteorites falling to Earth. But if we were to take this idea and go back to the time before that happened, if Planetos originally had 2 moons, and if they were to circle the sun, what would it's hard to envision, but what would it look like if one of them were to eclipse, if one of those moons eclipsed the sun? Again, because we're never told. It's safe to presume that there's only one sun for Planetos, but if there were 2 moons, and if there were to be an eclipse, then it would look like then it would look like 2 black stars up in the nighttime sky. The sun would be eclipsed by one, and it would wash away the light of the other. So this is where, again, I think George he has Carcosa out in the Far East as a bit of an Easter egg, and I'm pretty sure I'm sticking to it with my gut feeling that the Hidden Sea is a reference to the Lake of Holly. But the elements of Carcosa from the Chamber story, the actual city, and then later adapted by Derleth, I think play more into Ashai. So now we'll just go back, remove this, and so let me peruse real quick. Is there any other pieces of artwork that I really wanted to show? I am going to have one more to promote later. So we showed the Biaki, we showed the Shantok, we did Ygoth, we did Carcosa. I guess we can just put just because we actually I haven't actually put up any real Hastur artwork. Let's just put up a Hastur. I have the one by Nando Altars, which I'm using for the YouTube thumbnail, but let's also bring up. Yeah, this is by Mike. Let me share the screen real quick, make sure I'm doing this right. Share your screen, Chrome tab. Yeah, this is one of the most common depictions of Hastur in the avatar of the King in Yellow, and you can see like the yellow sign on his medallion, and the squid tentacles that just show that he is like an elder octopus-like being, like Cthulhu. And we're just gonna go. I'll keep this artwork up, and we're gonna go into excerpts of Tatters of the King. So again, this is written by Lynn Carter, who I said at the beginning of the stream was actually in life was a friend to George. Mr. Carter passed away in 1988, but he made some great contributions to the Carcosa mythos and the Cthulhu mythos, where he tried to sort of adapt the King in Yellow into a proper play. Again, like you can't really make a real play when the whole idea of the play is that it drives people to madness. Like you can't actually bring that in real life, but he did create a script, and so Tatters of the King is actually 3 parts. It starts with a poem called Litany to Hastur. Then it goes into the Carcosa story about Holly, and from there, then it goes into his own script of the King in Yellow. But all we're going to read for this is we're going to read the poem A Litany to Hastur, and then we're going to do Carcosa story about Holly, and then we'll talk. After that, we'll talk more Euron. Okay, so Litany to Hastur. Black Lotus. The Coven Master gave to me a phial of that dread opiate that is the key to dream gates opening upon a sea of archritonic vapors mile on mile, stretched ebon coasts untrod, where from aspire pylons of rough-hewn stone climbing the skies, alien constellated where arise gray mottled moons of cold and leprous fire. My dream self roam the cosmic gulfs profound, past demon-haunted Hadith, where in deeps of foul putrescence buried underground, the loathsome Shoggoth hideously sleeps. I saw and screamed, and knew my doom of dooms, learning at last where the black lotus blooms. I drank the golden mead and did those things, of which I read within the ancient book. The wind awoke, the elms and willows shook, before the thunder of fantastic wings. Down from the cosmic gulfs the monster fell, the grim stupendous back-winged Bayaki, come from the cloudy shores of Lake Hali, black-furred and iron-beaked with eyes of hell. When I bestrode its back, the beast unfurled its vast and mighty wings. Across dark seas of space we flew, amid the Hyades. We reached at last that bleak and mythic world, to men forbidden and by gods abhorred, Carcosa, where the great Hastur is lord. It was a scene that I had known before, this barren, desolate, and drear expanse, through which I wandered in a dreamlike trance. And there in somber splendor by the shore of dark Holly, the nameless city stood. Black domes and monolithic towers loom, stark and gigantic in the midnight gloom, like druid menhirs in a haunted wood. These streets and walls I seem to half recall, wandering blindly through the winding ways, beneath a sky with strange black stars ablaze. From some mad dream, or was it dream at all? Aye, here it was I heard Casilda sing, where flapped the yellow tatters of the king. Down the dark street of monoliths I passed, the shambling faceless figure of my guide, a voiceless thing that I beckoned at my side, and to the dreaded gate I came at last. Before the silent guardian I made the black unhallowed sacrifice, and spoke name at whose sound forgotten echoes woke. The portal's gate I entered unafraid. Fate or my stars of some accursed pride had brought me here. Naked, I stood alone, and took the vow before the elder throne. He laughed and drew his tattered mantle wide. Oh, do not seek to learn nor ever ask what horror hides behind the pallid mask. Now, we can take that, and again, we can juxtapose this scene from this poem, the things that are going on, with ideas of what's going on in Forsaken. And we can probably, we won't know for sure until we actually get the Winds of Winter. But one thing that I alluded to, again, in the five Force stream, and in the 5 Force streams with Dave, is that when we do get Winds of Winter, unless we get a POV chapter from Sam's point of view, our main point of view for what's happening on the ground with Euron is going to be the Damphair. It's going to be Euron, but Euron is tripping massive on on Shade of the Evening wine. So it's going to be really hard to know what the things he's describing, what's actually happening, and what's just part of the Shade of the Evening trip. And that's the thing that we're going to be, when I'm sure we're going to spend, when that book drops, I think that's going to be one of those are going to be the chapters that we're going to spend a lot of time dissecting, trying to figure out, the things that the Damphair is going to describe to us, what's really going on, what's just this drug trip, like what's actually happening. Are Krakens actually going to rise? What's Euron really doing? And lo and behold, we might find out later that some of the more fantastical elements that the Damphair may describe may actually end up being more true than we think they are. But we don't know. We can only speculate on that one until it comes out. All we have right now is the Forsaken with Euron, and Euron is already having these just horrible nightmare visions. Is this real life or is this just fantasy? Caught in a landslide, no escape from reality. Look to the sky. We can't sing. I'm gonna get copyright hit if I sing any more of that song. But the damp Harry is just a poor boy, but he needs no sympathy. Okay, and then so that was the poem. So that was Litany to Hastur, and then next we're going to the last story we're going to read for the night is Carcosa's story about Holly. And this is written in 14 paragraphs. They're kind of like stanzas. So I'm just going to say, so 1, now it came to pass late in the first year of the terror that they that reigned from Beetlejuice spake in his dreams to their servant, the necromancer Holly, yea, even him that was called Holly the Wise. And he rose up and departed him hence from the immemorable city. It did wander for some certain time in the wilderness, beneath the twin suns and the strange moons that illume the skies of that world of Carcosa that is in the Hyades, and whereof the scribe doth write. And in sooth, now that the graves did give up its sheeted dead to stalk and gibber through the streets, it beseemed wise for a necromancer like Holly to make himself scarce. Okay, so here, when Holly is a character, Holly is a necromancer and a philosopher. And the Lake of Holly is named for him. Holly also appears in he is the author of the opening quote from an inhabitant of Carcosa, which I read in the Carcosa and Beyond stream. So I'm just gonna summarize the line. But he is the author of the opening line. For there be diverse sorts of death. Somewhere in the body remaineth, and in some it vanisheth quite away with the spirit. In one kind of death the spirit also dieth, and this it hath been known to do, while yet the body was in vigor for many years. Sometimes, as is veritably attested, it dieth with the body, but after a season is raised up again in that place where the body did decay. Or, if we want to sum it up in fewer words, and in the mortal language of the Ironborn, what is dead may never die, but rises again, harder and stronger. Holly also appears in another Ambrose Bierce story, The Death of Halpin Fraser, which is another story that I want to read. It's a great work of Gothic fiction, and it has so many elements in it that harken to the Others and the Whites and the Haunted Forest. But in that, he says, for by death is wrought greater change than hath been shown. Whereas in general, the spirit that removed cometh back upon occasion, and is sometimes seen of those in flesh, appearing in the form of the body it bore. Yet it hath happened that the veritable body without the spirit hath walked, and it is attested of those encountering who have lived to speak thereon, that a lich so raised up hath no natural affection, nor resemblance thereof, but only hate. Also it is known that some spirits which in life were benign become by death evil altogether. The language in that it reminds me so much of the Others and the Whites, the Others as these necromancers and as these liches, and this the zombies of the Whites that they're bringing. And we can also kind of see this with not just with the Whites that the Others are raising, but also with the Fire Whites, the things that Melisandre is becoming and that Victarion may be becoming, at least with his cool firearm that Makoro has upgraded him with. And so, but back to the story. Okay. 2. And these things had come to pass in the days that followed hard upon the heels of the appearance of that apparition that arose from out of the nothingness that was before time, and that is beyond space, and that smote fear into the hearts of all those that did dwell in the beshadowed ways of the immemorable city, the which befell in the early years of the reign of that Aldons, even he that was the last king of the immemorable city, at least until the coming thither of the king in yellow, as has been aforetime foretold by the very apparition of the Phantom of Truth. Okay, Aldonis is a king, but we don't. But the thing about Aldonis is a character in the King in Yellow play. He is supposed to be the husband of Casilda and the father of her 3 children, Camilla, Tane, and Uth. And Uth sounds a lot like oath. Now, Camilla as a character she's described as, just looking for my note. I have in my notes. Casilda, she is the, where did I put that note about Casilda and Aldonis? I don't think Google Docs saved the note that I had about Casilda. Nope, it definitely did not. Okay, I'm gonna have to remember. I'm gonna have to remember on the fly. Okay. So Casilda is described as both a sad and apathetic queen to the city of Hastur that she rules over. And again, she has 2 sons and a daughter, Tail, Uth, and Carmilla. And we see this with 2 other queens that we can pick out of the story, which is Cersei, though she's not more apathetic. Well, she's apathetic to the struggles of the people of King's Landing. And I guess she is sad for Joffrey's death, but she's also but Casilda's sadness and apathy is to the point where she's really not doing anything for the city of Hastur, whereas Cersei is doing things. She's not doing the correct things. She's ruling terribly, but she is doing things. Another one that Casilda reminds me of, again, with this whole the idea of the sad queen is Rhaella, Daenerys's mother. And then just as Casilda has 2 sons and a daughter, both queens, Cersei and Rhaella, they have the same. They have 2 sons and a daughter. Cersei has Joffrey, Tommen, and Marcella. Rhaella has Rhaegar, Viserys, and Daenerys. Why did I blank on Dany's name? She's a fucking main character. Okay, but Aldonis, the father, his name Aldonis is actually just the Hasturian word for father. So we're not actually sure if that's even his real name or if it's just supposed to be about him being the father of the royal family. What we do know is that Carmilla, her brothers are vying for her hand in marriage to continue the royal line. And this is something that we don't see with Cersei's children because the Baratheons don't follow incest the way the Targaryens did. So this ends up being more like Dany, who thought that she would have been married to Viserys most of her life. But the other thing about the 2 brothers, Tane and Ulf, Tane embraces the yellow sign, which is the symbol of the King in Yellow, and the King in Yellow is the stranger who shows up in the play wearing the pallid mask. Whereas Ulf is more he's more cautious of the King in Yellow. In fact, he's actually he's more afraid of the yellow sign, and he's more superstitious. And but this kind of parallels to Euron and Victarion. Ulf is also described as being a fat man wandering through the sewers. Now, Victarion isn't fat, but he is described as big and barrel-chested. And he isn't wandering through sewers, but Victarion is doing the dirty work for Euron. He's the one, because he's the one taking the best ships from the Iron Fleet, sailing to Slaver's Bay, and he has his adventures on the Isle of Monkeys, who I'm sure we're throwing poop at him. That's probably that could be that could be our sewer parallel. Whereas Tane embraces the idea of the Yellow King. And both of these brothers are vying for the attention of Carmilla, who is this queen. Well, or who's the daughter of the queen. Now, in Song of Ice and Fire, if again, not a perfect one-to-one parallel, but we can look at Carmilla as Dany and Tane as Euron, the one who's vying for Dany's attention while also embracing this otherworldly eldritch things like the King in Yellow in Euron, and we see that in Euron's attempts to become a god himself, versus Victarion, who's also planning to steal Dany, but he is more superstitious and more accustomed to following the cultural Ironborn religion of the Drowned God. Now, as he's traveling with Moqorro, he does open up a bit more, because like when Victarion makes those sacrifices of the women on the boats, he's doing it for both the Drowned God and Moqorro's red god of the red god of R'hllor. So Victarion is not a total theologian, I guess. Not like the Damphair, who would never. The Damphair would probably never even consider the idea of honoring some other gods. But Victarion's at least being like, hey, you help too, so I'm also going to make sacrifices to your god. This is a twofer. Okay, so 3. In the fullness of time, it did occur to one Elhain, a priest of the elder gods in the immemorable city, that Hali the Wise had written his testament, much that foreshadowed the curse that now smote the city of Aldons, and that he had writ of the shades and permutations of that state, that by death is wrought greater change than hath been shown, whereas in general the spirit that removeth cometh back upon occasion, and is sometimes seen of those in the flesh, appearing in the form of the body it bore, yet hath it happened that the veritable body without the spirit hath walked. And it is attested that those encountering them who have lived to speak therein, that a lich so raised up hath so natural affection, no remembrance thereof, but only hate. Also it is known that some spirits which in life are benign become by death evil altogether. So that right there was just ripped straight from the Ambrose Bierce story, which was, I just had that title. The Death of Halpin Fraser, which, yeah, I think I definitely, now that we've had that quote twice, I definitely want to read that for another stream. But again, this language that the priest Alhain is using, and Alhain is a priest of the elder gods, we could take this scene and just as easily see Euron the Damphair preaching, that which is dead may never die, but rises again harder and stronger. And these are things that George is drawing upon for not just the Drowned God religion, but then later as we get further on, when Hastur has his rebellion. Thus writ Hali the Wise, and these words brought the priest Alhain to the attention of the king Aldonis, for it beseemed to this priest of the elder gods that if this necromancer was so deeply learned in the mysteries of death, he might well know the cause of the curse that now plagued the very streets of the immemorable city, where the dead walked and raved, and the living fled therefrom in fear. For it is not meet or seemly that the living and the dead shouldst commingle, since that each belongeth to a different sphere. And to these sentiments agreed, and right full-heartedly, the king, Aldonis, gave as his fiat that the priest Alhain should seek out the necromancer, Hali, and whatever far and fabulous bourne he now had taken as his home. So this is another idea that crops up in A Song of Ice and Fire, and we can see this with the Faceless Men and their idea that which has to be, that death comes for us all. And this is something that, Dave has talked about in a number of streams in the Faceless Men. The idea of the others raising the dead is like an affront to the religion of the Faceless Men. Things that are dead need to stay dead. But here, the king Aldonis is going against that, and he's urging this priest of the elder gods to seek out this necromancer. Now for a time did the sage Holly wander in this wilderness, the which was not inhabited by men such as he, but only by the shy and furtive youths, the which but rarely glimpsed by mortal eyes, and then but dimly and from afar. And these quaint and curious creatures, the youths, be of much interest, and that they perambulate about upon 3 legs instead of 2, and in a mode and manner most novel and intriguing. And there were as well in these parts the loathly and abominable nests of the Bayaki, the which were wont to roost in peaks adjacent to these regions. But of the Bayaki the scribe writeth not, by reason of the grisly ways thereof, that which be not quite wholesome to discuss. Now the Black Lake, on whose bleak shores the sage soon reared his hut or hovel, was in no wise like unto the other lakes to be found upon this world of Carcosa in the Hades. For the waters thereof were dark as death, and cold as the bitter spaces between the stars, and not that was composed of simple flesh lived or could live in the gloomy and fetid deeps thereof. This is a shy language. The Black Lake, and devoid of life, bitter spaces, nothing can live in this. It's like the River Ash. The River Ash does have some things living in it, but they're just these deformed fish, and nothing else can drink, and nothing can drink the waters. No animals can live in a shy because of just the atmosphere of it. And it is said that a cold and clammy mist drifted ever above the bitter waters of the Black Lake, as a shroud clings to a moldering corpse. And this mist swayed to and fro with the wheeling of the black stars and the strange moons of Carcosa, and they in the immemorable city knew this as the cloud waves. And it was whispered by men that these cloud waves hid forever from the sight of men a monstrous thing that had fallen upon Carcosa from the stars uncounted and uncountable aeons before this time, and that this thing yet lived, albeit in a state of solemnness, from the which it woke betimes, ravening with hungers unspeakable. And the sages said that this dweller in the depths was of the very spawn of Azathoth, and half-brother even to dread Cthulhu, the lord of the great abyss. And that the thing in the lake had made it with the black ewe with 1,000 young. Aye, even Shub-Niggurath, upon that hellish and cloud-like entity, had begotten the twin abominations, even Nug and Yeb. And it was deemed unprudent to utter upon the lips of men the name of the thing in the lake. Wherefore was it known as the Unspeakable. And this we can see both the Hastur, along with the Euron parallels that I've been drawing upon. Just as he's Hastur the Unspeakable, that which will not be, that cannot be named. We think of, like in Relorism, the Great Other. His name cannot actually be named. When in the fullness of time, the priest Alhain had sought out the hovel wherein dwelt the necromancer, and had made converse with Holly the Wise upon that matter, the which had roused all of Carcosa, and they spake of the dead that had risen to wander abroad and to ravish the living, even the living that they themselves had loved and cherished when they had been alive. Whites. We can see, this is like whites, and whites going after the people that they once loved in life. The free folk, the free folk talk of this. Osha talks of this when her husband came back. Tormund Giantsbane speaks of this, like, having to kill your own family again because they've come back as whites. Holly mused and at length spake thusly from the profundities of his wisdom. Know, O Alhain, for that there be diverse sorts of death. Somewhere in the body remaineth, and in some it vanisheth quite away with the spirit. So again, we're opening lines again from an inhabitant of Carcosa. And saith yet further, now this commonly occurreth only in solitude, being such the will of the elder gods. Now he changed the line because in the original inhabitant of Carcosa, it's just the will of God, but here it's the will of the elder gods. And none seeing the end thereof, we say the man is lost or gone upon a long journey, which indeed he hath. But sometimes it hath happened in full sight of many, as abundant testimony showeth. In one kind of death the spirit also dieth, and this it hath been known to do, whilst yet the body waste in vigor for many years. Sometimes, that is veritably attested, it dieth with the body, but after a season is raised up again in that place where the body didst decay. Thus spoke the necromancer Hawley to the priest Alhain. Now at length it came out in their converse that those of the dead, whose likes had been seen to stalk and raven through the very streets of the Emerald City, were even those the which had been given unto the thing in the lake and sacrificed thereunto, that it was given unto Hawley the Wise to ponder greatly thereat. For such as he, that knew the many forms and shapes of death, was greatly puzzled and baffled at this manifestation of the law of the dead hitherto unbeknownst, even to the necromancer such as he. Long had Hawley the Wise known of the abominable custom of binding, of hurling into the bitter depths of the black lake certain victims, such as were designated to feed the hunger of him that slept beneath. And long had Hawley the necromancer loathed and abominated this custom. And now that it was revealed unto him that those of the dead who rose to walk again the beshadowed streets of the Emerald City were even the same as them that had been fed to the thing in the lake, he had great cause to think and to ponder. You did see a cattail. My kitten Damon is roaming around here. So here we have like human sacrifice. People are being bound and thrown into the lake. This is where we get to see more Euron parallels, because what is Euron doing? Euron is binding people to the prows of his ship. He has the warlocks, septons, priests. He has Folly of Flowers, who is carrying his child because that unborn child would have king's blood. He has Euron strapped to the Silence, and Euron's actually, it doesn't come up often, but Euron's actually a twofer when you think about it, because he is a priest, so he has the holy blood. But being a brother to Euron, he also would have king's blood. So Euron's a double whammy in this whole idea of blood sacrifice. For well wasted known to such as Hawley the Wise that the thing been of hurled into the black lake was even Hastur the Unspeakable, him who is not to be named, great prince of the old ones, prince and rebel against the elder gods, not chained in the depths of the black waste of the black lake was Hastur in these days, but hiding therein, wary and fearful of discovery by those whom he has betrayed and fled therefrom. And very great and powerful was Hastur the Unspeakable, greater than any mere mortal man. And that very night, under the blaze of black stars and beneath the leprous glimmer of strange moons, did the elder gods whisper in his dreams unto their servant, even the necromancer Hawley. But whereof waste wast upon the scribe knoweth not, and therefore he writeth not. But upon the morrow it is said that the necromancer sought out the shale of the rocky cliffs, and found there amongst a certain grey-green stone, whose name the scribe knoweth not, and that from this stone, with patient labor, did the necromancer cut certain signs and sigils. 5-pointed stars were these, with blunted tips, and in the very midst thereof were cut in shapes like lozenges, opened at both ends, containing shapes like unto towers of flame. So that's the end of that story. And the thing that I see with this, so we have the character of Hastur, and he's being given sacrifices in the lake. And the priest, and we have the necromancer of Hawley, and we have the priest Alhain. Alhain is playing the part of Euron in this story. And yes, because Alhain is a priest to the elder gods, but here he is in the lake that Hastur is in with the necromancer Hawley, writing the tales of what he sees. In the same vein, again, these are not perfect one-to-one parallels, but Euron, he's not writing about the deeds of Euron, but he is our eyes on the ground because he's our POV where we're going with this. And yes, and Euron, in his attempts to become a god, wants Aeron to renounce the drowned god, proclaim Euron as a god, and be his high priest. So we see again these parallels with Aeron as the priest of Elhain, and Euron in playing this role of Hastur. Now the and so where we're missing is the necromancer Holly. But we do have a couple necromancers throughout the story because we have Melisandre, who's becoming a Firewhite. We have the others who are necromancers. Makoro, who may be a necromancer with what he's doing with Victarion. Bran may be a necromancer. He's told by Bloodraven, you can't raise the dead, but don't try. But so you shouldn't try, but don't try anyway. So, which kind of means like, hey, well, if he can't do it, then why'd you tell him not to try? It's like, it probably means that he can do it. And this goes back to what we had said before about Jon's body being wrestled by these forms of fire magic, green seer magic, and icy magic, and what exactly it is that'll bring Jon alive. And if the others lose control over Jon, if he's wrestled back from the others, either through fire magic or green seer magic or a combo of their two, then the others are still going to need probably going to need a new host. And that's where we see Euron coming in. And Euron, through his attempts, like I'm repeating myself, but I keep calling it opening the chaos door. And I've had this idea that if Euron succeeds in what he's trying to do with what he's doing at Old Town, or even if he takes it further and does like another huge blood sacrifice, he might bite off more than he can chew. That's the thing with these Lovecraftian stories and the contemporaries that followed Lovecraft is you're not supposed to see what hides behind the veil. To do so is to cause madness. And I can actually see Euron just being steamrolled by whatever's on the other side, by whatever he unlocks with this magic he's doing. And the seeds of that are set through the Victarion chapters, because after Makoro does what he does to Victarion and gives him that sweet fire hand upgrade, the Victarion's chapters are no longer POV, but written in third person. Now, it's going to be harder with Euron because he's not a POV to begin with. But it is possible that Euron, after this blood sacrifice at Old Town, Euron might not really be Euron anymore. The Euron we see in the later chapters of the Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring, if he makes it that far, might be Euron just being remote piloted by the Great Other, or just some kind of eldritch abomination that he was never meant to see. Like that, and that's where I see this going, and that brings us back to the idea of even though it pained me to read it, the Derleth story, The Return of Hastur. Hastur's goal was to take over the body of Amos Tuttle. Amos Tuttle passed away, so Amos said, but it seems like the contract that was writ was, okay, well, if it's not Amos was written away that it's not Amos Tuttle, but it's whoever lives in the house on Aylesbury Road. That's why Amos Tuttle wanted the house to be destroyed after his death. But because his nephew didn't do it, his nephew ends up paying the price, and he becomes the one that is possessed by Hastur, so that Hastur can have an earthly form. And this is what I definitely see happening with Euron. Euron probably be possessed, not by Hastur, but by some kind of Hastur-like eldritch abomination that he was never meant to see. And so Euron, in a way, he parallels Hastur, but he also parallels those that Hastur is looking to possess, so that he has a body on Earth. And just want to see if there's anything else I wanted to add before wrapping this up. No. No, I think we're good. So, just to summarize. So, Euron as the king in yellow, the pallid mask is the eye patch. It's Euron hiding his blood eye, but also hiding his true intentions. His intentions to become a god. That is the mask that Euron wears. And Euron is the storm. He calls himself, I am the storm, the first and last. Euron invokes the storm god, who is the enemy of the drowned god, in the way that Hastur is in Derleth's elemental blaze is an air element who is enemy to the water element Cthulhu. Again, I really don't like that Derleth tried to create this pantheon and throw these gods in a box, but it does help in kind of showing like this whole storm god, drown god juxtaposition with the idea of Hastur warring against Cthulhu. But again, at the same time, Hastur is a half-brother of Cthulhu in the same way that Euron, despite rejecting the drown god and rejecting all other gods, is still a brother to Victarion, Aeron, and Balon, who did follow the drown god. Aeron, a fanatic, and Victarion, more customary, just kind of like a devout, not a priest, but definitely a devout follower. And of course, and their oldest brother Balon, before his passing, who wanted to bring them back to the old way. Euron is rejecting this god, just as he's rejecting all gods, but that still doesn't change the fact that Euron's a Greyjoy, that he's Ironborn. Even if he rejects the drowned god, he's still culturally tied to it. And we see that, but he still uses that to his advantage by using it as a means to an end, manipulating the Ironborn by having them help him with this blood sacrifice, because they see it as a sacrifice to the drowned god, even though it's reality a sacrifice to Euron. And Hastur requires sacrifices, those that are bound and thrown into the lake, just as Euron has the priests, the warlocks, and people like Folly of Flowers who are currently holding King's blood through the child of Euron that she's carrying. These are the Hasturian elements of Euron. These are the king in yellow elements of Euron. And that's what I want. That's the meat and the meat of what I want to get at with these Euron, Hastur, king and yell parallels. Again, they're not perfect 1-to-1 ratios. They never are. Nothing's going to be perfect, but you can see elements that George is picking up on through Lovecraft, through Derleth, and through his own friend Lynn Carter, who wrote that last tale, who wrote Tatters of the King. And again, and just to hammer it home, the great, Euron has his personal sigil of the crows carrying the crown, but as a Greyjoy, his family sigil is the Kraken. Cthulhu and Hastur are Krakens, but it's a yellow Kraken. It's not a gray Kraken invoking the Grey King. It's not a green Kraken, which would be more Cthulhu-esque. Gray and green would both be more Cthulhu-like colors. It's yellow. It's a yellow Kraken. And that's just another Hasturian element. And it's Hastur being both the enemy of Cthulhu, but related to Cthulhu, warring with family. And in Euron, it's the same. His war is it's going to be all of Westeros. But first and foremost, Euron is warring against family. Killed 3 brothers, manipulating another, holding another captive, possibly about to murder that one too in a blood sacrifice, or if Aeron lives, maybe Euron might get what he wants, and Aeron might break and lose faith, and he might renounce the drowned god and say, he's not saving me. Just in the way that Euron was never punished by the drowned god for killing his brother, Euron might see that the drowned god is not coming to save him. But if he submits to Euron, then Euron might, big maybe, but Euron might release him, take him off the prow, untie him, bring him back onto deck, and he'll at least live. It remains to be seen. This is one of the things I'm definitely waiting on in the Winds of Winter to see where Euron goes, but also to see where Victarion, where Aeron go. I want to know, is the damp hair going to lose his faith and submit to Euron? Or is he going to die? Is he going to be one of these many blood sacrifices? That's up in the air. Hopefully, I can't wait for Winds of Winter so we can get more of that. But yeah, so we've gone for over 3 hours. I read the stories I want to read. I hope I made my point, that you can kind of see where I'm coming from, that I'm not just, it's, again, these aren't, I keep saying these aren't perfect one-to-ones, but you see the ideas that I'm drawing off of, that I think that George is drawing off of, with by having these Easter eggs in the Far East, by comparing Carcosa to Ashai, and the Ashai and the elements that Euron's picking up from Ashai and Karth, and bringing back to Westeros, and his attempts to become a god all of his own. The last thing I want to do is I just want to share real quick this my sigil. House Morgan Kelly of the Grey Waste has a sigil. This is on my Twitter if you want to follow me on my Twitter at the Grey Waste. This was designed by my friend Nick Eck at Eck Design. Let's see, Chrome tab. Sure. Okay, so this is the house sigil of House Morgan Kelly of the Grey Waste. So this was designed by my friend Nick Eck at Nick Eck Design. Links to all of his social medias are in the video info, his Facebook, his Twitter, and his Instagram. We drew inspiration from the House Blackwood sigil, the dead weirwood tree surrounded by crows, surrounded by ravens. I'm sorry, because it's Raven Tree. Why am I saying crow? It's because it's Raven Tree Hall in House Blackwood. That's Blood Raven's family. I drew inspiration from that. Only mine is a black tree, so it's the shade of the evening tree on a blue field. This is to invoke the blue sap from the shade of the evening trees, and the blue leaves that the shade of the evening one is drawn from. And bordering it are Emperor moths. Now, I wanted to originally go with Death's Head moths, but there already is a house with the Death's Head moth sigil. It's House Horp. They're Stormland's house that's sworn to Stannis, but they're actually Queen's men, Melisandre's men. So I went with Emperor moths instead, because Emperor moths, they have what looks like eyes on their wings. Emperor moths also, they're the only moths that you can find in Great Britain, where which what Westeros is based. I mean, there's a lot of Europe that Westeros is based off of, but the big inspiration is Great Britain, War of the Roses. But Emperor moths also go all the way out across Europe into Russia and even into Siberia. And I've talked about the Grey Waste, I feel, is an analogy for it parallels real world Siberia, just as far Moscovy parallels Russia. And that's the real world parallel. And then the in-story parallel, the Grey Waste, the frozen desert, would be the eastern version of the lands of always winter. And far Moscovy, the grim gray forest of Moscovy, would be the eastern version of the haunted forest. Actually, that's another stream I want to do, because even though me and Dave did the 5/4 stream, we went for 2.5 hours. We actually never got to Moscovy. So I think another stream for the future I might do is even further, will be an even further east stream where we'll talk Moscovy, the Grey Waste, and the idea of the Northern Passage. the white waste, and the idea of what happens if you sail west from Westeros and this Sunset Sea linking up with Essos. And we can talk more First Men of the East theories and House Dane and more Fall of the Great Empire stuff. I think that'll be a good stream. I'll do for next time. Anyway, so the moths, so it's a dead Shade of the Evening tree. And the idea is that the emperor moths, when they are caterpillars, ate the blue leaves, because emperor moths eat a plant called blackthorn. And blackthorn, the berries of blackthorn are used to make gin and sloe. So here's so you got blackthorn, which, so it's a black plant with whose berries are used to make liquor. Shade of the Evening trees have their blue leaves and blue sap used to make Shade of the Evening wine. So the idea is that the caterpillars ate the leaves of the Shade of the Evening tree, emerged as not as moths, opening their third eye. And that's so it's like it's a lot of symbolism packed into one. And also I went with moths just because it started out as a bad joke, something about like those people who are named Timothy, why would you go by Tim for short when you got Moth right in the name? And for me, just a little bit about me. My name is Timothy. I'm named after Timothy Leary. I'm named after a mood. Most specifically, I'm named after a Moody Blues song about Timothy Leary, which Moody Blues, Timothy Leary, Legend of a Mind. My dad named me Timothy Leary after Legend of a Mind. My parent, which is also my dad. My dad's like prog, like Moody Blues, Pink Floyd, King Crimson, Rush. Like that's my dad's musical taste. My mom was a punk. My mom was like Sex Pistols, Ramones, and that's kind of influenced my musical taste. But yeah, I'm named after Timothy Leary, the man who famously said to tune in, turn on, and drop out. So this whole, it's also not only fitting my brand as Gray Waste Tim with this with the Shade of the Evening tree, the Gray Field, and the whole Siberia Russia thing, but the moths, but also the idea of opening your third eye, because I'm named after a man who famously told people to drop acid. So the sigil, and I love how it came out, and I can't thank Nick enough, and I'm gonna pay him. It's a commission. I am paying him cash monies for this. And if you weren't around for the beginning of the stream, he also gave me a bonus panel. So we'll take this off, remove, and we'll share. Bring back up the bonus panel that I had up at the beginning of the stream. Yeah, just like an hour before I planned to go live, he emailed me this, and I was like, "Oh, well, that's it. That's definitely going. That's an opener and a closer right there." King in yellow, king in yellow, king in yellow. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming, hanging out with me. Thanks for listening to me rant about Derleth's prose. Thank you, Nick Eck. Again, check out Nick Eck. Check out Nick's artwork in the links provided. Check out David Lightbringer. My great, I can't thank Dave enough for all the help that he's given me and for promoting me and just being an all-around friend in all of this, and for having me on his streams. Also, thank you to Gray Area. I recently was on Obsidian Knight's podcast with her. We did Tyrion 1 and A Clash of Kings. I mod for Direwolf City, just as I mod for David Lightbringer. Also want to shout out the Disputed Lands, Crowfood's daughter, Amanda. She's done fantastic Ironborn videos, and they've been that's another big influence on me and wanting to do Euron video and just Ironborn lore. Especially when I picked up more on this Hastur King in Yellow stuff, because it's something that hadn't been explored. So it's new ironborn waters that we're sailing in. And yeah, so check out all of them. Check out other videos. Check out my essays on Reddit, and follow me on Twitter at The Grey Waste. And I'll see you next time. I really do think the next stream will, no set date. Again, I'm not a professional streamer. This is a hobby. I do these for fun. This is when I have free time. But I think we'll do an even further East stream. We'll talk far Mossavi and more Grey Waste. I definitely have ideas about Mossavi. And we'll talk like First Men of the East and this idea of where House of the Danes and the High Towers and stuff coming over from the Great Empire. And then I definitely do want to read that other Ambrose Bierce story that we brought up, just because of how much imagery it has that invokes the idea of like the others, the whites, and the haunted forest. So that's 2 streams to look forward in the future. I'm also working on my den. I hope to get an actual proper setup, so that's not just me sitting in the recliner while Damon runs around. I do want to do actual videos, not so that there aren't all of these giant 3-hour streams. I want to do like short 15 to 30-minute videos in the future. But yeah, so thank you, everyone, and I hope to see you all next time. Good night.